Her father sees her as a transaction. The Apache sees her as his future. When a desperate trade collides with a hidden romance, the town is set ablaze with whispers, threats, and the promise of blood. The ring on her finger becomes more dangerous than the deal for horses, because it binds her to a man the world says she cannot have. CLARA WHITMAN never imagined her father would gamble her away like cattle. But when drought killed their crops and debt collectors circled their failing ranch, Thomas Whitman saw only one way out. The Apache chief Standing Bear had the finest horses in the territory, and he wanted something Thomas possessed: his daughter. What Thomas didn't know was that Clara had already given her heart to Standing Bear's son, APACHE Wind, who had secretly placed his mother's sacred ring on her finger 3 moons ago. Now 2 worlds were about to collide in ways that would change everything. But will love be enough to survive what's coming next? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dried corn stalks stood like skeletal monuments to Thomas Whitman's failing dreams. Each withered plant represented another dollar lost, another day closer to losing everything he'd spent 20 years building in the unforgiving New Mexico territory. The summer of 1883 had brought no mercy, only endless blue skies and a sun that baked the earth until it cracked like broken pottery. Clara moved through the remains of their vegetable garden, her worn boots kicking up dust that settled on her faded calico dress. At 19, she possessed her mother's delicate features, but had developed the calloused hands and sun-weathered skin of a woman who knew real work. Her auburn hair, braided and pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat, caught the morning light as she bent to examine the few surviving bean plants. "Nothing worth saving here, Papa," she called to Thomas, who stood on the porch studying a stack of papers with the grim expression of a man counting his debts. Thomas Whitman had once been considered prosperous by frontier standards. His ranch, though modest, had supported a small herd of cattle and produced enough crops to trade in town. But prosperity in the territory was always temporary, always subject to the whims of weather, disease, and the dangerous proximity to Apache lands that kept many settlers away. The drought had begun in late spring, just as Clara's mother Sarah would have been planting her annual flower garden. Sarah had died giving birth to Clara 19 years ago, leaving Thomas to raise their daughter alone. He'd never remarried, partly from grief, and partly because Clara had become the center of his world, the living reminder of the woman he'd loved more than life itself. "Come inside, Clara," Thomas called, his voice carrying the weight of decisions she wouldn't understand until it was too late. "We need to discuss our situation." Clara brushed the dust from her skirts and climbed the 3 wooden steps to their modest home. The house had been built for a family, with 2 bedrooms and a main room that served as kitchen, dining room, and gathering place. Thomas had crafted most of the furniture himself, solid oak pieces that spoke of permanence and hope for the future. The papers spread across their dining table told a different story. Bills from the general store, notices from the bank, invoices for seed and supplies that had yielded nothing but disappointment. Thomas had kept the worst of their financial troubles from Clara, but now the weight of protecting her from reality had become more burden than kindness. "How bad is it, Papa?" Clara asked, settling into the chair across from him. She'd inherited her mother's intelligence along with her beauty, and Thomas had always treated her as a partner in running the ranch rather than a child to be sheltered. "Bad enough that we need to make some hard choices," Thomas admitted, removing his hat and running weathered fingers through graying hair. At 45, he looked older, worn down by the constant struggle to survive in a land that demanded everything and promised nothing. Clara studied the papers, her quick mind calculating the numbers that spelled potential ruin. The cattle, sold the last of them 3 weeks ago to pay the most urgent debts, got less than half what they were worth last year. Thomas's voice carried the bitterness of a man who'd watched his life's work diminish with each passing day. "The land, still ours, but the bank's getting impatient. They want payment in full by September, or they'll foreclose. Thomas looked out the window toward the barren fields that mocked his years of labor. Even if the rains come tomorrow, we can't plant enough to make a difference this season. Clara rose and moved to the kitchen, returning with 2 cups of weak coffee. They'd been rationing everything, making each precious supply last as long as possible. The gesture was automatic, a remnant of better times when hospitality and comfort were taken for granted. What about trading with the Apache? Clara asked carefully, her heart suddenly beating faster for reasons she couldn't reveal to her father. Thomas looked up sharply. What do you know about trading with the Apache? I know Chief Standing Bear has the finest horses in the territory. I know he sometimes trades with settlers for goods he needs. Clara kept her voice steady, though mentioning Standing Bear's name brought images of his son to her mind. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, considering possibilities he'd avoided thinking about. Trading with the Apache was legal but dangerous, requiring a level of trust that most settlers couldn't manage. The recent peace treaty had created opportunities for commerce, but old fears and prejudices died hard on both sides. Standing Bear's horses would be worth enough to save the ranch, Thomas mused, more to himself than to Clara. But he doesn't trade for money. He wants goods, supplies, things his people need. What kinds of things? Thomas hesitated, knowing he was approaching territory that might change everything between them. I've heard he's looking for a wife for one of his sons, someone to strengthen ties between our peoples. Clara's coffee cup rattled against its saucer, and she hoped her father attributed the trembling to surprise rather than the complex emotions swirling through her heart. She thought of the turquoise and silver ring hidden in her mother's Bible upstairs, the sacred symbol of love that Apache Wind had placed on her finger just 3 moons ago. You wouldn't consider such a thing, would you, Papa? Clara asked. Though she already knew the desperate look in his eyes provided the answer, Thomas reached across the table and took his daughter's hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of her partnership in their struggles. I would never force you into anything, Clara, but we're running out of options, and I won't let you lose everything your mother and I built here. The late afternoon sun slanted through their windows, casting long shadows that seemed to point toward an uncertain future. Clara understood that their conversation had crossed a line from which there might be no return. The drought had taken more than their crops. It had taken their choices, their security, and perhaps their ability to control their own destiny. What would happen to me if we lost the ranch? Clara asked quietly. You'd survive. You're strong and smart, like your mother was, but you deserve better than just survival. Thomas squeezed her hand gently. You deserve the chance to build something lasting, to have the life we dreamed of giving you. As evening approached, Clara helped her father prepare their simple supper, both of them lost in thoughts they couldn't share. The dried corn stalks outside stood as silent witnesses to dreams that had withered under an unforgiving sun, while inside, father and daughter contemplated choices that would change everything they thought they knew about love, loyalty, and the price of survival. The medicine pouch hung against Apache Wind's chest, its soft leather worn smooth by countless touches. Inside, sacred herbs mingled with his most precious possession, a lock of Clara's auburn hair, cut secretly during one of their forbidden meetings at the old trading post. The pouch had belonged to his grandfather, a powerful shaman who'd seen visions of 2 worlds joining in peace. Apache Wind wondered if the old man had foreseen the love that now burned in his heart like a sacred fire. It had begun 6 months ago, on a day when spring rain had temporarily broken the drought's grip. Apache Wind had ridden to Miguel Sandoval's trading post, a neutral ground where Apache and settlers could conduct business without the suspicion that poisoned most interactions between their peoples. Clara had been there with her father, trading eggs and butter for supplies they couldn't afford from the town's general store. Apache Wind remembered the exact moment their eyes met across the crowded room. Clara had been examining a bolt of blue cloth, her fingers testing its quality with the practical knowledge of someone who made her own clothes.
When she looked up, their gazes locked with an intensity that made the rest of the world fade into silence. Neither had spoken, but something fundamental had shifted between them, as if the earth itself had moved beneath their feet. The trading post occupied a unique position in the tense relationship between settlers and Apache. Miguel Sandoval, a Mexican trader who'd married an Apache woman, understood both cultures and served as an unofficial mediator when conflicts arose. His establishment sat on neutral ground, marked by white flags that promised safe passage to all who came in peace. Apache Wind had grown up, hearing stories about the old days, when his people moved freely across the vast landscape, without boundaries or restrictions. His father, Standing Bear, had fought in the final wars, but had chosen the path of negotiated peace when continued resistance meant extinction for their people. The reservation provided safety but not freedom, and young Apache men like Wind struggled with the constraints of a life they hadn't chosen. At 25, Apache Wind possessed the physical strength and warrior skills his people valued, but his heart yearned for something beyond the traditional path of raiding and warfare. He'd learned English from the missionaries and Spanish from traders like Miguel, understanding that survival in the new world required adaptation. His vision for the future included peaceful coexistence between Apache and settlers, a dream that many in his tribe considered naive or treasonous. Clara had begun visiting the trading post more frequently after their first encounter, always with legitimate business, but always hoping to see the Apache warrior, whose dark eyes haunted her dreams. Apache Wind did the same, timing his visits to coincide with hers while maintaining the pretense of ordinary commerce. Their courtship had unfolded through stolen glances, careful words, and the electric tension of attraction that couldn't be openly acknowledged. Miguel had noticed their growing connection and had quietly facilitated their meetings, understanding the dangerous nature of their attachment, while recognizing the pure emotion that drove it. His own marriage had taught him that love could bridge cultural divides, but only at great personal cost and constant vigilance against those who would destroy what they couldn't understand. The first time Clara and Apache Wind spoke privately, they'd met behind Miguel's store, while their respective fathers conducted business inside.
The conversation had been awkward, filled with careful questions about each other's lives and beliefs. Clara had been surprised by Apache Wind's intelligence and gentleness, so different from the savage stereotypes that filled settlers' imaginations. Apache Wind had been struck by Clara's courage and curiosity, her willingness to see him as a man rather than an enemy. Their secret meetings had continued through the late spring and early summer, always in carefully chosen locations where they wouldn't be observed. Sometimes they met at an old line shack abandoned since the drought began. Other times they would encounter each other along the creek that marked the boundary between Apache lands and settler territory. Each meeting had deepened their connection while making them more aware of the obstacles that stood between them. Apache Wind had told Clara about his mother, Snowdove, who had died when he was 12 years old. She had been known for her wisdom and her ability to see beyond the hatred that divided their peoples. On her deathbed, she had given her son the turquoise and silver ring that had been passed down through generations of Apache women, telling him to give it only to the woman who would help bridge two worlds. Clara had shared stories about her mother, Sarah, who had died giving birth to her, but whose memory lived on in every aspect of their ranch life. She'd shown Apache Wind her mother's garden spot, now withered from the drought, but still holding traces of the herbs and flowers that Sarah had loved. They'd talked about loss and longing, about the burden of living up to parents' dreams while forging their own paths. 3 months ago, on a night when the full moon had turned the desert silver, Apache Wind had placed his mother's ring on Clara's finger. The ceremony had been simple but profound, witnessed only by the stars and the ancient spirits his people believed watched over true love. Clara had wept at the beauty of the moment, understanding that she was accepting not just Apache Wind's love but his entire heritage and the challenges that came with it. Since then, Clara had worn the ring on a chain around her neck during the day, hidden beneath her clothes where her father wouldn't see it. Only at night, in the privacy of her room, did she place it on her finger and allow herself to dream of a future that seemed impossible, given the prejudices and fears that shaped their world. Apache Wind had confided their secret to only one person, his closest friend Running Wolf, who had grown up alongside him and shared his vision of peaceful coexistence. Running Wolf had warned him about the dangers they faced, not just from hostile settlers, but from Apache warriors who viewed any connection to white society as betrayal. The young lovers were walking a narrow path between two worlds, and a single misstep could destroy them both. Their most recent meeting had taken place just days ago, at the old cottonwood tree that marked the halfway point between their homes. Apache Wind had seemed troubled, and Clara had sensed that something was changing in the careful balance they'd maintained. He'd spoken about his father's increasing pressure for him to marry within the tribe, to take a wife who could help preserve Apache traditions and bloodlines. "My father has plans for my future," Apache Wind had said, his dark eyes reflecting a sadness that made Clara's heart ache. "Plans that don't include the woman I love." Clara had taken his hands in hers, feeling the calluses earned through years of horseback riding and traditional Apache skills. "Then we'll have to make our own plans," she'd whispered, though neither of them knew how such a thing might be possible. Now, as Apache Wind touched the medicine pouch that held Clara's hair, he wondered if their love was strong enough to survive the challenges ahead. The drought that threatened her family's survival also threatened their secret meetings, as increased desperation made everyone more suspicious of unusual behavior. He'd heard rumors about white families considering extreme measures to save their failing ranches, and he feared what those measures might mean for the woman he loved. The evening star appeared in the darkening sky, and Apache Wind sent a prayer to his ancestors, asking for wisdom and strength to protect the love that had transformed his world. Tomorrow he would ride to the trading post, hoping to catch a glimpse of Clara and perhaps steal a moment of conversation that would sustain him through the difficult days he sensed were coming. In the distance, thunder rumbled across the desert, promising rain that might not come, but reminding everyone that change was constant and often unexpected. Apache Wind closed his eyes and listened to the ancient voice of the land, seeking guidance for the choices that would soon test everything he believed about love, loyalty, and the possibility of building bridges between worlds that seemed determined to remain forever apart. The horse contract lay between Thomas Whitman and Chief Standing Bear, like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Written hastily on brown paper in Thomas's careful engineer's script, it outlined terms that would either save the Whitman ranch or destroy everything Clara held dear. 12 of the finest horses in the territory in exchange for his daughter's hand in marriage to Standing Bear's son. The ink was still wet, but the words felt carved in stone. Thomas had ridden to the Apache encampment before dawn, driven by desperation and the gnawing certainty that he was running out of time. The bank's deadline loomed like a storm cloud on the horizon, and every day brought fresh evidence that the drought would claim another season. He'd spent 3 sleepless nights weighing his options before concluding that this arrangement might be Clara's only chance at a secure future. Standing Bear's camp occupied a broad valley protected by red rock formations that had sheltered Apache families for generations. Despite the restrictions of reservation life, the chief had maintained many traditional customs, and his people lived in a mixture of army-issued canvas tents and traditional wickiups. The horses that had made Standing Bear legendary among both Apache and settlers grazed in carefully guarded herds that represented wealth beyond most settlers' imaginations. The chief himself commanded respect through presence rather than decoration. At 52, Standing Bear possessed the weathered dignity of a man who'd fought for his people's survival and made the difficult transition from warrior to negotiator. His English was functional but careful, and he conducted important business through interpreters to ensure that nothing was lost in translation. Miguel Sandoval had facilitated the meeting, serving as interpreter and witness to negotiations that could reshape relationships between the two communities. The Mexican trader understood the delicate nature of what was being discussed and had emphasized the mutual benefits that such an arrangement could provide. For Standing Bear, it offered a connection to the settler community that might protect his people from future conflicts. For Thomas, it provided the resources necessary to save his ranch and secure Clara's future. "Your daughter," Standing Bear had said through Miguel's translation, "she is known to be strong and intelligent. These are qualities valued by Apache women. My son will need a wife who can help him lead our people in the new world." Thomas had nodded, though he wasn't entirely certain which of Standing Bear's sons was being discussed. He'd heard there were two, both of warrior age, both unmarried. The details seemed less important than the fundamental agreement that would trade Clara's hand for the horses that could pay off his debts and provide working capital for the ranch's recovery. "She will be treated with honor," Standing Bear had continued. "Apache wives are partners, not possessions. She will learn our ways while teaching us hers. The children from such a union will walk in both worlds." The negotiation had proceeded with careful attention to cultural sensitivities and practical concerns. Clara would have time to prepare for the transition, learning basic Apache customs and language. The wedding ceremony would incorporate elements from both traditions, demonstrating respect for her background while welcoming her into Apache society. The horses would be delivered gradually, allowing Thomas to integrate them into his ranch operations without overwhelming his limited facilities. Thomas had insisted on certain protections for Clara, drawing on his knowledge of Apache customs to ensure she would have status and security within the tribe. Standing Bear had agreed to these conditions, seeming to appreciate Thomas's concern for his daughter's welfare. The chief had spoken at length about the importance of strong marriages in building bridges between peoples who had been enemies for too long. What neither man had discussed was the question of Clara's consent to the arrangement. Both cultures had traditions of arranged marriages where parents chose partners based on practical considerations rather than romantic attachment. Thomas assumed Clara would understand the necessity of the sacrifice, while Standing Bear believed his son would be honored to marry a woman of such obvious quality. The horses that sealed the agreement were magnificent specimens that represented years of careful breeding and training. Standing Bear's herds included Spanish stock, brought north by early explorers, mixed with hardy Mustangs that had adapted to desert conditions over centuries of natural selection. The 12 animals promised to Thomas would be worth more than his entire ranch at current market values. As Thomas signed the hastily drafted contract, his hand trembled slightly with the weight of what he was committing. Clara's future was now tied to people and customs she barely understood, but it was a future that included security and respect, rather than the poverty and uncertainty that awaited if the ranch failed. He told himself he was making the responsible choice, the loving choice, even as his heart ached at the thought of losing the daughter who had been his anchor since Sarah's death. Standing Bear had signed the document with careful deliberation, using the English name the government required for official business. His Apache name, which meant the one who stands firm against the storm, better reflected his character and the challenges he'd faced in leading his people through the transition from warfare to reservation life. This marriage arrangement was another form of diplomacy, another way of standing firm while adapting to circumstances beyond his control. Miguel had witnessed both signatures, understanding the historical significance of the moment. Intermarriage between Apache and settlers had occurred before, but never with such formal recognition and community support from both sides. If successful, this union could serve as a model for the kind of cooperation that might allow both peoples to thrive in the changing landscape of the American Southwest. The ride back to his ranch had given Thomas time to consider how he would explain the arrangement to Clara.
She was intelligent and practical, qualities that would serve her well in any circumstances, but she was also young and might not immediately understand the wisdom of what he'd negotiated. He planned to emphasize the respect Standing Bear had shown for her abilities and the opportunities the marriage would provide for both families. Thomas had also spent the ride thinking about Sarah and what she would have wanted for their daughter. His wife had possessed a compassionate nature that extended beyond the prejudices common to their time and place. She'd often spoken about the possibility of peace between the peoples who shared this harsh but beautiful land. Perhaps this marriage would fulfill some of her dreams, while securing Clara's future in ways that conventional arrangements could never provide. The sun was setting by the time Thomas reached home, painting the dried landscape in shades of gold and amber that reminded him of better times. Clara was waiting on the porch, her face showing the worry that had become constant since their financial troubles began. She'd prepared their simple evening meal and set the table with the good dishes they rarely used anymore, perhaps sensing that this day would bring news that changed everything. "How did it go, Papa?" Clara asked as Thomas dismounted and tended to his horse with automatic care. Thomas looked at his daughter, seeing Sarah's features mixed with his own stubborn determination, and wondered if he'd just saved her future or destroyed any chance she had for happiness. The contract in his vest pocket felt heavier than the horses it had purchased, weighted with consequences he couldn't fully predict.
"We need to talk, Clara, about your future and the choices I've had to make to protect it." As they entered the house together, neither father nor daughter could have imagined that the careful negotiations of the afternoon were about to collide with a love story that had been unfolding in secret for months, transforming what seemed like a practical solution into an impossible tangle of competing loyalties and divided hearts. Sheriff Jake Morrison's badge caught the morning light as he leaned against the post outside Murphy's General Store, its tarnished silver reflecting both his authority and his prejudices. The six-pointed star had belonged to his predecessor, a man who died enforcing the uneasy peace between settlers and Apache that followed the final treaty. Morrison wore it like a shield against change, particularly the kind of change that threatened the clear boundaries he believed necessary for civilized society. The news of Thomas Whitman's arrangement with Chief Standing Bear had spread through the town faster than wildfire in dry grass. By noon on the day following the negotiation, everyone in Willowbrook knew that a white woman was going to marry an Apache warrior in exchange for horses. The reactions ranged from shock to outrage to fascination, depending on the listener's prejudices and understanding of frontier realities. At Murphy's store, Elizabeth Murphy stood behind the counter sorting mail while listening to conversations that grew more heated with each retelling of the story. At 63, she'd seen enough of frontier life to understand that survival sometimes required uncomfortable compromises. Her husband Patrick had traded with Apache for 20 years without incident, building relationships based on mutual respect and fair dealing. "It's unnatural," declared Mrs. Helen Carpenter, a recent arrival from St. Louis, whose husband had established the town's only bank. "No decent Christian woman should be subjected to living among savages, regardless of the family's financial difficulties." Elizabeth looked up from her mail sorting, her Irish accent still noticeable after 4 decades in America. "And what would you have Thomas Whitman do, Helen? Let his daughter starve when he's got the chance to secure her future?" "There are Christian solutions to financial problems," Mrs. Carpenter replied stiffly. "Charity, family assistance, honest work, not this barbaric trafficking in human flesh." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Desi Hayes, whose medical practice served both settlers and Apache when injuries or illness crossed cultural boundaries. At 58, Doc had delivered half the babies in Willowbrook and treated victims of both Apache raids and settler violence. His perspective on the proposed marriage carried the weight of someone who'd seen the consequences of hatred and the benefits of cooperation. "Morning, ladies," Doc said, touching the brim of his hat. I couldn't help overhearing your discussion about the Whitman situation." Sheriff Morrison straightened, recognizing an opportunity to assert his position on the matter. "Doc, you've dealt with the Apache more than most. You know what kind of people they are. This arrangement is going to bring nothing but trouble to our community." Doc Hayes selected his words carefully, understanding that his response would be repeated throughout the town within hours. "I know that Apache families value their children as much as we value ours. I know that Chief Standing Bear has kept his word in every dealing I've had with him. And I know that Clara Whitman is intelligent enough to make her own decisions about her future." "Her own decisions," Mrs. Carpenter scoffed. "She's being sold like livestock to people who don't even share our faith or our values." "Apache people have their own faith and values," Doc replied quietly. "Different from ours, but not necessarily inferior. And from what I understand, Clara will have considerable status as the wife of Standing Bear's son." The argument might have continued indefinitely, but it was interrupted by the arrival of Father Gonzalez from the small Catholic mission that served Willowbrook's Mexican and mixed heritage families. The priest had maintained friendly relations with both communities and often found himself mediating disputes that arose from cultural misunderstandings. "Good morning, my friends," Father Gonzalez said in accented English. "I see we are discussing the Whitman-Apache situation. Perhaps I might offer a perspective based on my experience with marriages between different peoples." Sheriff Morrison's expression hardened. "With respect, Father, this isn't about Catholic Mexicans marrying Protestant Americans. This is about a white woman being handed over to Indians who were killing settlers just 10 years ago. And now they are not killing settlers," Father Gonzalez observed. "Perhaps this marriage could help ensure that peace continues. In my country, such unions between Spanish and indigenous peoples helped create a new society that honored both traditions." The debate moved from Murphy's store to the Red Horse Saloon, where Pete Davidson served drinks and opinions in equal measure to the men who gathered to discuss the day's events. Pete had fought Apache during the territorial wars, but had also traded with them during peacetime, giving him a complex understanding of the relationship between the two communities. "Question is," Pete said while polishing glasses, "what does Clara Whitman think about all this?" "Nobody's asked her opinion that I've heard." Martin Henderson, the bank manager who'd been pressing Thomas for payment, took a long drink of whiskey before responding. "Women don't get much say in these matters, Pete. Thomas Whitman's doing what he thinks is best for his daughter's future." "Maybe so," replied Carlos Santos, whose family had moved to Willowbrook from California 5 years earlier. "But I've seen what happens when families make arrangements without considering what the young people want. Sometimes it works out, sometimes it causes nothing but misery for everyone involved." The conversation was overheard by several townswomen who'd come to collect their husbands for the evening meal. Word of the men's discussion spread quickly through the network of wives and mothers who managed most of the town's social communication. By nightfall, everyone in Willowbrook had heard multiple versions of the story, each colored by the teller's own attitudes about race, marriage, and the proper role of women in frontier society. Sheriff Morrison spent the evening making rounds, ostensibly checking on security, but actually gauging public sentiment about the proposed marriage. He found the town divided along predictable lines. Recent arrivals from back east were uniformly horrified by the arrangement. Longtime residents showed more acceptance, understanding that frontier life required flexibility and compromise. Mexican families were generally supportive, having their own experience with cross-cultural marriages and mixed heritage children. The most concerning reactions came from young men who'd been courting Clara or had hoped to marry her themselves. Johnny Fletcher, whose family owned the livery stable, had been visiting the Whitman ranch regularly for months, bringing small gifts and making awkward conversation while hoping to win Clara's affections. The news that she was promised to an Apache warrior had triggered a rage that worried more thoughtful observers. "It ain't right," Johnny complained to anyone who would listen. "Clara Whitman's too good for some savage, no matter how many horses he's got." Her father's lost his mind if he thinks this is going to work out. Similar sentiments were expressed by other young men who felt their romantic prospects had been damaged by Thomas's arrangement. Their anger wasn't directed solely at the Apache, but at the perceived injustice of losing a desirable woman to someone they considered racially inferior. Mrs. Chen, who operated the town's only laundry service, offered a different perspective during her evening rounds collecting clothes for washing. As someone who'd experienced prejudice herself as a Chinese immigrant, she understood the challenges facing anyone who crossed cultural boundaries in pursuit of love or security. People always afraid of what they don't understand, she observed to Elizabeth Murphy while collecting the store's linens. Maybe this marriage helped people understand Apache not so different from us. Maybe good thing for everyone. The evening concluded with an impromptu meeting at the schoolhouse, where concerned citizens gathered to discuss the implications of the Whitman-Apache marriage for their community's future. Sheriff Morrison had called the meeting, ostensibly to address security concerns, but many attendees suspected he had broader goals in mind. This arrangement could set a dangerous precedent, Morrison argued to the assembled crowd. If we allow this marriage to proceed, what message does that send to the Apache about our community's standards and expectations? Doc Hayes stood to respond, his medical authority giving weight to his words. It sends the message that we're mature enough to judge individuals by their character rather than their race, that we're confident enough in our own values to allow our neighbors to make their own choices about their futures. The meeting ended without resolution, but the lines had been drawn. CLARA WHITMAN's future had become a symbol of larger questions about race, culture, and the direction of their frontier community. The whispers that had begun with shocked gossip were evolving into organized opposition that would test everyone's commitment to the principles they claimed to hold dear. As the townspeople returned to their homes that night, few could have predicted that the greatest shock was yet to come. The woman at the center of their debate had already made choices that would transform their carefully planned arguments into something far more complex and dangerous than anyone imagined. The war paint remained untouched in its sacred bowl, the red and black pigments that had marked Apache warriors for generations growing dry. While Apache Wind stared at his reflection in the still water of the ceremonial basin, his grandfather's paint, earned through vision quests and battle honors, waited to transform him into the warrior his people expected him to become. But the man looking back from the water's surface had already chosen a different path, one that led away from war and toward a love that defied every tradition he'd been raised to honor. Running Wolf found him there as the sun reached its highest point, sitting motionless beside the paint bowl, like a statue carved from the red rock that surrounded their encampment. The two young men had grown up together, shared the trials that marked their passage from boys to warriors, and confided dreams that went beyond the boundaries of reservation life. If anyone could understand Apache Wind's turmoil, it would be his closest friend. "Your father has been looking for you," Running Wolf said, settling cross-legged beside Apache Wind on the smooth stone that overlooked their valley home. "The whole camp knows about his arrangement with the white rancher." Apache Wind continued staring at his reflection, watching the water ripple with each breath of desert wind. "And what does the whole camp think about their future chief marrying a white woman? Some think it shows wisdom, building bridges to the settler world that our children will inherit." Running Wolf paused, choosing his words carefully. "Others think it shows weakness, abandoning Apache ways for the comfort of our former enemies." The truth that Apache Wind couldn't share with anyone except Running Wolf burned in his chest like swallowed fire. The white woman his father had chosen wasn't a stranger whose heart he would have to win through patience and respect. She was Clara, the woman who already wore his mother's ring, and who had already given him her love through months of secret meetings that violated every rule governing contact between their peoples. "What do you think?" Apache Wind asked, though he already knew his friend's answer. Running Wolf had always possessed the practical wisdom that came from seeing clearly, without the burden of romantic idealism.
He understood that survival in the changing world required adaptation, but he also knew that some adaptations came at the cost of everything that made life worth living. "I think you are asking the wrong question," Running Wolf replied. "The question is not what I think, or what the camp thinks, or even what your father thinks. The question is what the spirits think, and what your heart tells you is true." Apache Wind finally looked away from his reflection, meeting his friend's eyes with an expression that revealed the depth of his internal struggle. "My heart tells me that love should not be the color of skin or the accidents of birth. My heart tells me that the woman my father has chosen deserves better than a marriage based on political convenience. And what does your heart tell you about your duty to your people?" The question struck at the center of Apache Wind's dilemma. As Standing Bear's eldest son, he carried expectations that went beyond personal happiness. His marriage would be watched by both Apache and settlers as a symbol of how well the two cultures could blend. His children would inherit leadership roles that required them to navigate between worlds that remained suspicious of each other despite official peace treaties.
"My people need leaders who understand both worlds," Apache Wind said slowly, working through thoughts that had kept him awake for 3 nights. "But they also need leaders who choose their own paths rather than having paths chosen for them." Running Wolf nodded, understanding the complexity of his friend's position. "Your father believes this marriage will strengthen our people's future. But what kind of future is built on arrangements made without considering the hearts of those most affected?" The two friends sat in comfortable silence, watching shadows move across the valley as clouds drifted overhead. Their encampment below showed signs of the changes that had reshaped Apache life over the past decade. Traditional wickiups stood beside army-issued tents. Children played games that mixed old Apache traditions with skills learned at the government school. Women wove baskets using patterns passed down for generations, while also learning to sew clothes in the white fashion required for their children's education. Apache Wind's own education had prepared him for the leadership role his father envisioned, but it had also exposed him to ideas about individual choice and personal freedom that complicated traditional Apache concepts of duty and obligation. He'd learned to read and write in English, studied the laws that governed the reservation, and developed relationships with sympathetic whites who shared his vision of peaceful coexistence. "There is something else," Apache Wind said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something I have not told my father or the tribal council." Running Wolf waited, understanding that his friend was approaching a confession that would change everything between them. "The white woman, CLARA WHITMAN, I know her." Running Wolf's expression didn't change, but Apache Wind could see the calculation behind his eyes as his friend processed the implications of this revelation. "Know her how?" Apache Wind reached into his medicine pouch and withdrew a small object wrapped in soft deerskin. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a lock of auburn hair that caught the sunlight like spun copper. "Know her as the woman who holds my heart. Know her as the one who wears my mother's ring. Know her as my wife in all ways except the ceremonies that would make it recognized by our peoples." Running Wolf stared at the hair, understanding immediately why his friend had seemed so tormented by what should have been welcome news. "How long?" 6 months. "We met at the trading post and began meeting in secret. 3 moons ago, I gave her my mother's ring, and we pledged ourselves to each other under the full moon." The weight of this revelation settled between them, like a stone dropped into still water. Running Wolf had known about his friend's frequent trips to the boundary areas, but he'd assumed they were routine patrols or hunting expeditions. The reality was far more dangerous and complicated than anything he'd imagined. "Does she know about your father's arrangement?" "Not yet, but she will learn soon when her father tells her what he has negotiated." Apache Wind rewrapped the lock of hair and returned it to his medicine pouch. "I must decide whether to tell my father the truth or allow him to proceed with arrangements that are based on false assumptions." "What would happen if you told him?" Apache Wind had considered this question from every angle, and none of the possible outcomes offered much hope. If I tell him about Clara and me, he might cancel the arrangement out of anger at my deception. That would leave her father without the horses he needs to save his ranch. If I don't tell him, the marriage ceremony will reveal our previous relationship, probably in ways that embarrass both families and damage the trust this arrangement is supposed to build. Running Wolf rose and walked to the edge of their rocky perch, looking down at the camp where children played and women worked while men discussed the future of their people. When he turned back to Apache Wind, his expression carried the gravity of someone who understood that his next words would influence decisions that affected more than just two lovers. Perhaps there is a third choice. Perhaps you could tell your father about your relationship with Clara, but frame it as evidence that the marriage arrangement is blessed by the spirits rather than cursed by deception. Apache Wind looked up sharply, intrigued by his friend's suggestion. Think about it, Running Wolf continued. What are the chances that your father would choose as your bride the exact woman you had already chosen for yourself? Your grandfather, the shaman, would have called it a sign from the spirit world, confirmation that some marriages are made by forces greater than human planning. The idea offered a path through the seemingly impossible maze of conflicting loyalties and hidden truths that had trapped Apache Wind for weeks. If he could present his relationship with Clara as evidence of spiritual approval rather than youthful rebellion, he might be able to honor both his love and his duty to his people. But the plan also required perfect timing and careful management of information that could destroy everything if mishandled. Clara would need to understand her role in the larger drama, and both families would need to accept a version of events that preserved everyone's dignity while acknowledging the deeper forces at work. It could work, Apache Wind said slowly, but it requires Clara to agree to a public courtship that follows our secret marriage. It requires both our fathers to accept that love and politics have intersected in ways that serve everyone's interests. And it requires you to trust that the love you share is strong enough to survive being transformed into a symbol of hope for two peoples who have been enemies for too long. Apache Wind looked once more at the war paint that his ancestors had worn into battle, then carefully poured the unused pigments back into their containers. The warrior path that had defined Apache manhood for generations would have to make room for a different kind of courage, the courage to love across boundaries that others considered absolute. Tomorrow he would seek a private audience with his father, armed with a story that transformed secret rebellion into spiritual destiny. The success or failure of that conversation would determine not only his own future, but the future of the woman whose auburn hair rested against his heart like a sacred talisman. The family Bible lay open on Clara's bed, its worn leather covers revealing pages yellowed with age and marked with the careful notations of 3 generations of Whitman family history. Between the pages of the Book of Ruth, where Sarah Whitman had recorded Clara's birth in fading ink, the turquoise and silver ring caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the bedroom window. Thomas stood frozen in the doorway, staring at an artifact that transformed everything he thought he knew about his daughter's life. He had come to Clara's room looking for her mother's pearl necklace, the one piece of jewelry valuable enough to pawn if their situation became desperate enough to require such measures. Clara was in town with the neighbors' wives, helping prepare the church for Sunday services, and Thomas had thought himself alone in the house. The Bible had been displaced from its usual position on Clara's nightstand, fallen open to reveal the secret that would shatter the careful plans he'd made for her future. The ring was unmistakably Apache work, its turquoise stone set in silver, worked by hands that understood the sacred significance of such pieces. Thomas had seen enough Apache jewelry during his years in the territory to recognize the craftsmanship, but more than that, he recognized the specific style that marked this as a wedding ring, a symbol of commitment that carried weight in Apache culture far beyond its material value.
Thomas picked up the ring with trembling fingers, feeling the smooth turquoise that had been polished by countless touches and the silver that had been shaped by someone who understood its spiritual as well as aesthetic properties.
The craftsmanship spoke of generations of tradition, of knowledge passed down through Apache families who treated jewelry as sacred art rather than mere decoration. The implications of finding such a ring hidden in his daughter's Bible struck Thomas like a physical blow. Clara had not simply been traded to the Apache. She had already established a relationship with them that went far deeper than anything he'd imagined possible. The careful negotiations he'd conducted with Standing Bear, the formal arrangements he'd believed were protecting Clara's interests, all of it had been based on false assumptions about her innocence and availability. His first reaction was rage, not at Clara, but at the Apache who had dared to court his daughter in secret. The frontier code that had shaped Thomas's understanding of proper behavior demanded that such liberties be answered with violence, that the honor of his family be protected through force rather than negotiation. But as he held the ring and considered its implications, his anger gave way to something more complex and troubling. If Clara possessed an Apache wedding ring, given with the intention it clearly represented, then his arrangement with Standing Bear wasn't rescuing her from an unwanted fate. It was potentially destroying a relationship she had chosen for herself, forcing her into a marriage that would make her previous commitment either irrelevant or scandalous, depending on how the truth emerged. Thomas sat heavily on Clara's bed, surrounded by the evidence of the daughter he'd thought he knew. Her room reflected the practical nature of frontier life, but also the touches that revealed her personality. A pressed flower collection from her childhood expeditions with her mother. A small mirror that had belonged to Sarah, reflecting back generations of Whitman women who'd lived and loved in this harsh but beautiful land. Books borrowed from the traveling preacher, revealing an intelligence that sought knowledge beyond the boundaries of their isolated ranch. The Bible itself told the story of Sarah's faith and Clara's inheritance of that spiritual foundation. Sarah had recorded family births, deaths, and marriages in the margins, creating a historical record that connected their small family to the larger story of settlement and survival in the New Mexico territory. Now Clara's secret threatened to add a chapter that would challenge everything Thomas believed about family culture and the proper order of relationships between different peoples. Thomas heard horses approaching and quickly closed the Bible, slipping the ring into his vest pocket where it rested against his heart like an accusation. Clara's voice carried from the front yard as she thanked the Henderson women for the ride home from church preparation. He had perhaps 5 minutes to decide how to confront her with what he'd discovered, 5 minutes to choose between anger and understanding, between protecting his assumptions and protecting his daughter. Clara entered the house with the cheerful energy of someone whose conscience was clear, calling out her usual greeting while hanging her bonnet on the peg beside the door. She moved through their small home with the unconscious grace of someone completely comfortable in familiar surroundings, humming a hymn they'd practiced for Sunday's service. "Papa, you're home early? I thought you were checking the fence line in the south pasture." "I was. I came back because we need to talk." Thomas's voice carried a gravity that immediately altered Clara's mood. She looked at his face and saw the expression she'd learned to associate with serious family business, the look he'd worn when telling her about their financial troubles, and again when explaining his decision to approach Standing Bear about the horse trade. "Is it about the arrangement, about the marriage?" Thomas pulled the ring from his pocket and placed it on the kitchen table between them. Clara's face went pale, but she didn't deny recognition or attempt to explain away what clearly couldn't be explained. "Where did you get this?" Clara sat down slowly, her eyes fixed on the turquoise stone that had been her secret treasure for 3 months. "It was given to me by someone I love. An Apache. Yes, Standing Bear's son." Clara looked up sharply, surprised by her father's knowledge. "How did you know?" Thomas felt the pieces of a puzzle falling into place, creating a picture that was both clearer and more complicated than anything he'd imagined. "Because Standing Bear has arranged for you to marry his son, and this ring suggests that arrangement isn't as simple as I thought it was. The conversation that followed revealed truths that transformed both father and daughter's understanding of their situation. Clara told Thomas about meeting Apache Wind at the trading post, about their secret courtship, and about the ceremony under the full moon when he'd placed his mother's ring on her finger. Thomas listened without interruption, watching his daughter's face reveal emotions and experiences he'd never suspected. "Do you love him?" Thomas asked when Clara finished her story. "With all my heart. And does he love you?" "He says he does. He's proven it by risking everything to be with me." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of what he'd learned. The marriage arrangement he'd negotiated with Standing Bear wasn't forcing Clara into an unwanted union. It was potentially legitimizing a relationship that had already been established in secret. But it was also exposing that relationship to scrutiny and judgment from both communities at a time when tensions were high and tolerance was limited. "Clara, do you understand what this means? What we're facing if this becomes public knowledge?" Clara nodded, her eyes reflecting an understanding that went beyond her 19 years. "It means that everything you and Chief Standing Bear arranged is based on partial information. It means that Apache Wind and I have created a situation that could embarrass both our families or bring them together in ways that were never planned. It also means that people in town who are already opposed to this marriage will use our deception as evidence that the whole arrangement is scandalous and should be stopped." Clara reached across the table and took her father's weathered hand in both of hers. "Papa, I never meant to deceive you. But I also never imagined that you and Apache Wind's father would arrange exactly the marriage that we had already chosen for ourselves. It's like the spirits decided to help us by working through both our families." Thomas looked at his daughter's face, seeing Sarah's features, but also a strength and determination that was uniquely Clara's own. The ring that had seemed like evidence of betrayal now appeared to be proof of something rarer and more valuable, a love that had found a way to exist despite all the obstacles that should have made it impossible. "What do you want me to do, Clara? The arrangements have been made, the horses will be delivered next week, and the whole town is already talking about this marriage. How do we handle the truth about your relationship with Apache Wind?" Clara picked up the ring and slipped it onto her finger, where it caught the light and seemed to glow with inner fire. "We tell the truth, Papa. We tell both families that love found a way to make their practical arrangement into something blessed. We face whatever consequences come from that truth together." Thomas nodded slowly, understanding that his daughter had grown into a woman capable of making her own decisions about love, loyalty, and the future she wanted to build. The ring that had shocked him with its revelation of secrets now seemed like a symbol of hope, proof that sometimes the heart's wisdom exceeded the mind's careful planning. The discovery that would change everything had been made, and there was no going back to the simpler understanding that had existed just an hour earlier. Tomorrow they would face the task of explaining to both communities how a practical arrangement had become a love story, and how that love story might survive the tests that lay ahead. The talking stick rested in the center of the ceremonial circle, its carved surface worn smooth by generations of Apache hands and voices that had spoken truth within the sacred boundaries of tribal council. Eagle feathers and turquoise beads adorned the ancient wood, each decoration carrying spiritual significance that connected the present moment to countless generations of decision-making that had shaped Apache survival and identity. Today, the stick would facilitate a conversation that could determine whether Apache Wind's love would be seen as blessing or betrayal by the people who had raised him to lead. Standing Bear sat in the position of honor, his weathered face revealing none of the internal conflict that had kept him awake since his son's shocking revelation 3 nights ago. Apache Wind had approached him at dawn, carrying the weight of truth that transformed a political arrangement into a spiritual puzzle that challenged everything the chief thought he understood about fate, love, and the proper order of relationships between Apache and white peoples. The council circle included 12 of the tribe's most respected elders, men and women whose wisdom had guided their people through the transition from warfare to reservation life. Grey Hawk, at 78 the oldest member, had fought in the final battles against the cavalry and had lived long enough to see former enemies become trading partners. His opinion would carry significant weight with the younger council members who had never known life before the treaties. Moon Shadow, the tribe's most respected woman elder, had been Snowdove's closest friend and had served as Apache Wind's surrogate grandmother after his mother's death. Her understanding of marriage customs and women's roles in Apache society made her voice crucial to any decision about the proposed union with CLARA WHITMAN. She had examined the turquoise ring that Apache Wind had given to the white woman, confirming its authenticity as Snowdove's wedding ring and its spiritual significance as a symbol of eternal commitment. Apache Wind sat across from his father, his expression calm but his heart racing with awareness that the next hour would determine whether his love would be honored or condemned by the people whose approval he needed most. Running Wolf sat beside him, prepared to serve as witness to the secret relationship that had developed over 6 months of careful meetings and growing intimacy. The ceremony began with prayers to the 4 directions and the spirits of ancestors who watched over all Apache decisions. Sage smoke purified the circle, while each participant prepared their hearts and minds for the honest communication that the talking stick demanded. No one could speak unless they held the sacred object, ensuring that all voices would be heard and all perspectives considered before judgment was rendered. Standing Bear took the talking stick first, his deep voice carrying the authority of leadership, but also the uncertainty of a father who discovered that his son's heart had already chosen a path that the tribal arrangement was supposed to create. 3 days ago, I believed I was making a wise decision for our people's future. Standing Bear began, his words measured and deliberate. I negotiated with Thomas Whitman to secure horses our tribe needs, while building a bridge to the settler community through marriage between his daughter and my son. I believed this arrangement would strengthen both our peoples while honoring our traditions of strategic alliance through marriage. He paused, allowing his words to settle before continuing. Yesterday, my son revealed that the woman chosen by her father is the same woman chosen by his heart. The spirits have worked in ways that confuse human planning, while perhaps revealing divine wisdom that exceeds our understanding. Grey Hawk accepted the talking stick, his ancient hands trembling slightly, but his voice strong with the conviction that came from having witnessed 80 years of Apache history. I have seen many marriages in my lifetime, both arranged by families and chosen by hearts. The strongest unions combine practical wisdom with spiritual connection. If Apache Wind and this white woman have found love that crosses the boundaries between our peoples, perhaps the ancestors are showing us a path toward the future our children will inherit. Moon Shadow took the talking stick and examined Apache Wind with the penetrating gaze of someone who had helped raise him from childhood. Snowdove's ring carries the blessing of 4 generations of Apache women who wore it with honor and passed it to sons who proved worthy of its power. That my spiritual daughter chose to give this sacred object to a white woman speaks of love that transcends the boundaries our minds create, but our hearts recognize as true. The discussion continued as each council member shared their perspective on the unprecedented situation. Some expressed concern about the deception involved in the secret courtship, worrying that hidden relationships between Apache and settlers could create misunderstandings that threatened the careful peace both communities had worked to maintain. Others saw Apache Wind's relationship with CLARA as evidence that the younger generation possessed wisdom that their elders had overlooked. If love could bridge the gap between Apache and white cultures, perhaps such bridges should be celebrated rather than feared. Thunder Cloud,
a warrior in his 40s who had served as Apache Wind's mentor in traditional fighting skills, expressed the concerns of those who worried about abandoning Apache ways for white customs. How can we be certain that this white woman will honor our traditions while living among us? How can we trust that her love is strong enough to survive the challenges of joining a people she was raised to fear? Apache Wind accepted the talking stick from Thundercloud, understanding that his response to these concerns would determine whether the council would support or oppose his relationship with Clara. His words would need to demonstrate respect for Apache traditions, while also revealing the depth of his commitment to the woman who had captured his heart. I understand the concerns that have been shared, Apache Wind began, his voice steady despite the enormity of what he was risking. CLARA WHITMAN has spent 6 months learning our language, studying our customs, and demonstrating her commitment to building a life that honors both her heritage and ours. She wears my mother's ring not as decoration but as a sacred trust that she has proven worthy to carry. He looked around the circle, meeting each elder's eyes before continuing. More importantly, she has shown me that love can exist without demanding that either person abandon what makes them who they are. She has not asked me to become white, and I have not asked her to pretend. She was born Apache. Together we have created something new that honors both our peoples, while building a foundation for children who will inherit the best of both worlds. Running Wolf accepted the talking stick and provided testimony about the relationship he had witnessed, developing over months of secret meetings. His description of Clara's respectful approach to Apache customs and her genuine effort to understand their spiritual beliefs helped address concerns about her motives and commitment. The debate continued through the afternoon, with each council member weighing the unprecedented situation against their understanding of Apache law, custom, and spiritual guidance. The question wasn't simply whether to approve Apache Wind's relationship with Clara, but whether to embrace a model of cross-cultural marriage that could influence how their people related to the settler community for generations to come. As the sun began to set, Standing Bear called for the final vote that would determine his son's fate. Each council member would hold the talking stick and declare their position, with the majority decision becoming binding on all members of the tribe. The vote was closer than Apache Wind had dared to hope. 7 council members supported recognizing his relationship with Clara and proceeding with the marriage ceremony as planned. 5 expressed reservations but agreed to abide by the majority decision. None voted for outright rejection of the union, though several emphasized the need for careful attention to how the marriage was presented to both communities. Grey Hawk, as the eldest member, offered the final blessing that would sanctify the council's decision. The spirits work in ways that human wisdom cannot always understand immediately. Perhaps this union between Apache Wind and the white woman Clara represents the beginning of a new chapter in our people's story, one that honors our past, while embracing possibilities for the future that we have not yet imagined. Standing Bear rose and embraced his son, the gesture conveying both his acceptance of the council's decision and his personal blessing of Apache Wind's choice.
The talking stick was returned to its place of honor, having facilitated a conversation that would be remembered as the moment when the Apache chose to trust love over fear in their relationship with the settler community. As the council members dispersed to their families, each carried the responsibility of preparing their people for a wedding ceremony that would test everyone's commitment to the ideals of tolerance and hope that had been discussed in the sacred circle. The talking stick would rest until the next crisis required its wisdom, but the decisions made around it today would influence Apache Wind and Clara's future for generations to come. The rope ladder swayed against Clara's bedroom window, its makeshift construction of braided bedsheets and kitchen twine testament to desperation that had driven her to attempt what reason declared impossible. Each knot represented another hour of the sleepless night she'd spent crafting her escape route, another moment of wrestling with the choice between duty to her father and loyalty to the love that had defined her heart for 6 months. Clara had made her decision after overhearing the conversation between her father and Sheriff Morrison earlier that evening, The sheriff had arrived just as darkness fell, his badge glinting in the lamplight as he'd outlined his plan to protect Clara from what he called an unnatural union that would bring shame to their entire community. "Tom, you've got to see reason," Morrison had argued, his voice carrying through the thin walls of their modest home. "This arrangement with the Apache might solve your financial problems, but it's going to destroy your daughter's reputation and possibly her life. There are other ways to handle your debts that don't require sacrificing Clara to savages." Thomas had defended his arrangement with Standing Bear, but Clara could hear the uncertainty in his voice as Morrison painted increasingly dire pictures of what life among the Apache would mean for a white woman. The sheriff had spoken of other white women who'd been taken by Indians, stories that usually ended in madness, death, or desperate escape attempts that left families shattered and communities traumatized. What neither man knew was that Clara had already chosen her path months ago, when Apache Wind had placed his mother's ring on her finger under the full moon and promised to love her for all the seasons of their lives. The arrangement between their fathers wasn't forcing her into an unwanted marriage. It was legitimizing a relationship she'd already committed to with her whole heart. But the town's growing opposition to the marriage, combined with Morrison's barely concealed threats to intervene forcibly if necessary, had convinced Clara that she needed to reach Apache Wind before their enemies could prevent the wedding that would make their secret union public. The rope ladder was her attempt to escape not just her bedroom, but the suffocating pressure of a community that refused to understand the love that transcended their racial prejudices. Clara had waited until she heard her father's heavy breathing from his room next door, the familiar rhythm that indicated deep sleep, brought on by exhaustion and worry. The ranch work continued despite their crisis, and Thomas had spent the day repairing fences and tending livestock with the mechanical persistence of a man using physical labor to avoid thinking about problems that seemed to have no good solutions. The descent from her second-story window required more courage than skill, though Clara's years of climbing trees and exploring the countryside around their ranch had given her the physical confidence necessary for such an adventure. Each careful movement down the improvised ladder brought her closer to freedom, but also deeper into territory where a single mistake could mean serious injury or discovery by her father. The night air carried the sense of sage and distant rain, reminding Clara of the evening walks she'd taken with Apache Wind, when their relationship was nothing more than stolen moments and whispered promises. Those walks had taught her to move quietly through the darkness, to read the landscape by starlight, and to understand the rhythms of desert life that governed everything from the hunting patterns of nocturnal predators to the blooming cycles of night-flowering plants. Clara's plan was simple in concept, but dangerous in execution. She would make her way to the old cottonwood tree that marked the traditional meeting place between Apache territory and settler lands. If Apache Wind was watching for her, as he'd promised to do whenever the moon was bright enough for safe travel, they could discuss how to handle the crisis that threatened to destroy their carefully planned future. If he wasn't there, she would wait until dawn, and then return home before her father discovered her absence. The risk of being caught was enormous, but the risk of allowing others to make irreversible decisions about their relationship seemed even greater. The ground beneath her bedroom window was soft from recent watering of her mother's flower garden, muffling the sound of her landing, but also creating mud that would leave obvious traces of her escape route. Clara brushed dirt from her riding skirt and boots, then moved with practiced stealth toward the barn, where her mare waited in blissful ignorance of the midnight adventure that was about to begin. Saddling a horse in complete darkness required the kind of familiarity that came from years of caring for the same animal. Clara's mare, a gentle bay named Stella, had been her companion since childhood and responded to her mistress's touch with quiet cooperation that suggested understanding of the unusual circumstances. The ride toward Apache territory took Clara through countryside she knew intimately in daylight,
but which seemed transformed by moonlight into an alien landscape of shadows and uncertain distances. Every sound, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals through dry grass, the distant howl of a coyote, seemed amplified in the desert stillness. Clara had covered perhaps half the distance to the cottonwood tree when she heard the unmistakable sound of multiple horses approaching from the direction of town. Her heart stopped as she recognized the rhythm and organization that suggested a group of armed men moving with purpose rather than casual night travelers. She guided Stella off the main trail and into a grove of mesquite trees, hoping the shadows would conceal them while the riders passed. But as the group drew closer, she could make out voices that belonged to men she'd known since childhood, friends and neighbors who'd apparently decided that Sheriff Morrison's concerns required immediate action. "She's got to be heading toward Apache territory," she heard Johnny Fletcher saying, his voice carrying the bitter anger of a rejected suitor who transformed his romantic disappointment into righteous fury. No other reason for Tom Whitman's daughter to be out here alone at this time of night. "Maybe she's meeting that savage she's supposed to marry," replied another voice that Clara recognized as belonging to P.T. Davidson from the saloon. "Maybe they've been carrying on this whole time, and the marriage arrangement is just making it official." The truth of Pete's speculation would have shocked Clara if she'd been in any condition to appreciate irony. Instead, she focused on remaining perfectly still while armed men searched for her with intentions she could only guess at, but feared to discover. "Either way, we're doing her a favor by stopping this before it goes any further." Morrison's voice carried the authority of law enforcement, but Clara could hear the vigilante mentality that had transformed legal concern into extra-legal action. "Tom Whitman's lost his mind if he thinks trading his daughter to Indians is going to solve his problems." The search party spent 20 minutes combing the area around Clara's hiding place, their torches creating moving pools of light that missed her concealment by mere yards. Clara held Stella's reins with hands that trembled from fear and forced her breathing to remain quiet, despite the terror that made her heart pound like thunder in her chest.
When the men finally moved on, continuing their patrol toward the boundary between settler and Apache lands, Clara waited another 30 minutes before emerging from the mesquite grove. The encounter had shattered any illusions she might have had about the safety of her midnight journey and the benign nature of the community's opposition to her marriage. The ride back to the ranch took place in a state of alert caution that transformed every shadow into a potential threat and every sound into evidence of pursuit. Clara's rope ladder waited beneath her bedroom window like evidence of a crime that would be impossible to explain if discovered. The climb back to her room required even more care than the descent, as fatigue and nervous tension made her movements clumsy and uncertain. But Clara managed to regain her bedroom without waking her father, though she spent the rest of the night sitting by her window, watching the horizon for signs of the dawn that would bring new challenges and difficult decisions. The failed escape attempt had taught Clara important lessons about the dangers she and Apache Wind faced from their own communities. It had also demonstrated that their love would require protection, not just from official disapproval, but from vigilante action by men who viewed their relationship as a threat to the social order that defined frontier life. As morning light began to filter through her curtains, Clara carefully dismantled the rope ladder that had represented her desperate attempt to take control of circumstances that seemed increasingly beyond anyone's ability to manage peacefully. The twisted bedsheets would return to their domestic function, but the memory of the night's adventure would remind her that love sometimes required courage that went beyond anything she'd previously imagined necessary. The eagle feather rested in Standing Bear's weathered palm, its pristine white and brown markings untouched by the years that had passed since it was earned through his own vision quest as a young warrior. The sacred feather had belonged to his father and his father's father, passed down through generations of Apache leaders who had proven their worthiness to guide their people through times of crisis and change. Today it would serve as the symbol of blessing or judgment for Apache Wind's commitment to a love that challenged everything their people had believed about the boundaries between Apache and white worlds. Apache Wind knelt in the pre-dawn darkness beside the ceremonial fire that would burn throughout the 3 days of his trial, its flames casting dancing shadows across the red rock walls that surrounded the sacred valley where Apache men had sought spiritual guidance for countless generations. The location itself carried power that transcended human understanding, a place where the spirits of ancestors gathered to witness the struggles of the living and offer wisdom to those brave enough to seek it. Standing Bear had chosen this test, not from doubt about his son's love for CLARA WHITMAN, but from the necessity of ensuring that such love was strong enough to withstand the pressures that would inevitably follow their public union. The trial would require Apache Wind to survive alone in the desert for 3 days without food or water, seeking visions that would reveal whether the spirits approved of his choice and whether he possessed the strength to protect a marriage that would face opposition from both communities. "You understand what is required," Standing Bear said, his voice carrying the formal tone reserved for sacred ceremonies. 3 days alone with the spirits and your own heart. No food, no water, no human contact. If you survive and receive clear guidance from the ancestors, you will return with my blessing and this feather as proof of spiritual approval for your marriage to the white woman. Apache Wind nodded, understanding that failure would mean more than personal disappointment. If he couldn't complete the trial, it would be seen as evidence that the spirits opposed his relationship with CLARA, potentially forcing him to choose between his love and his standing within the tribe that had raised him to lead. The trial began at sunrise with prayers to the 4 directions and offerings to the spirit guardians who watched over Apache lands. Apache Wind had prepared for weeks through fasting and purification ceremonies that had stripped away everything except the essential question of whether his love for CLARA was blessed by forces greater than human desire. The first day tested his physical resolve as the desert sun climbed toward its merciless peak, and his body began to feel the absence of water and sustenance. Apache Wind had endured similar trials during his warrior training, but never while carrying the emotional weight of knowing that his entire future depended on successfully completing the ordeal. The sacred valley provided some shelter from the worst heat, but it also amplified the intensity of spiritual forces that seemed to press against Apache Wind's consciousness, like physical presences demanding acknowledgement. He spent the daylight hours in meditation and prayer, opening his mind to whatever guidance the spirits might offer, while his body gradually weakened from the voluntary deprivation. As darkness fell, Apache Wind began to experience the altered states of consciousness that marked successful vision quests. The boundaries between waking and dreaming became fluid, allowing him to encounter spiritual presences that appeared as combinations of memory, hope, and divine guidance. His mother, Snow Dove, came to him first, appearing as she had in life, but surrounded by the golden light that marked her transformation into ancestral wisdom. She spoke to him in the Apache language of his childhood, reminding him of the teachings she'd shared about love's power to bridge differences that seemed impossible to cross. "The ring I gave you was meant for the woman who would complete your spirit," Snow Dove said, her voice carrying across years and the boundary between life and death. "I see her in your heart, and I see the challenges that await you both. Love alone will not be enough. You must have the courage to become the bridge between worlds that your children will need." The vision of his mother faded as the night progressed, replaced by encounters with warrior ancestors who tested Apache Wind's commitment through challenges that seemed to emerge from the desert itself. He found himself reliving battles he'd never fought, making decisions that would affect generations he'd never meet, and defending principles that went beyond personal happiness to encompass the survival of his people's values in a changing world.
The second day brought visions that directly addressed his relationship with Clara and the obstacles they would face as a couple attempting to create a life that honored both Apache and white traditions. Apache Wind saw possible futures that ranged from triumph to tragedy, each one dependent on choices that he and Clara would make in response to the hostility and misunderstanding they would inevitably encounter. In one vision, he saw their children growing up as bridges between communities, carrying the best of both cultures while belonging fully to neither. In another, he witnessed the destruction that could result from love that wasn't strong enough to withstand the pressures of a society that feared what it couldn't understand. The most powerful vision came on the third night, when Apache Wind's physical weakness had opened doorways in his consciousness that normally remained closed to ordinary awareness. He found himself standing in a place that seemed to exist outside of time, where past and future converged in an eternal present that revealed the deeper patterns underlying human history. Clara appeared beside him, not as he knew her in daily life, but as the spiritual essence that had drawn his heart from their first meeting. Together they watched scenes from possible futures unfold, like stories told around a sacred fire, each one showing how their love might influence the relationship between Apache and white peoples for generations to come. "We are being asked to do more than marry," Clara said, though Apache Wind understood that this was his own spiritual insight, speaking through the vision of the woman he loved. "We are being asked to demonstrate that love can overcome the hatred that divides our peoples. That requires a different kind of courage than either of us imagined." The vision showed them the path they would need to walk together, one that demanded constant vigilance against the forces that would try to use their marriage as evidence of betrayal rather than proof of possibility. They would need to become symbols of hope while remaining human beings with ordinary needs for happiness and security. As the third dawn approached, Apache Wind felt the presence of his grandfather, the shaman whose prophecies had guided Apache Wind's youth, and whose wisdom had prepared him for this moment of testing. The old man's spirit appeared as a combination of memory and divine guidance, offering the final blessing that would determine whether the trial had been successfully completed.
"You have seen truly," the grandfather's spirit said, placing a spiritual hand on Apache Wind's shoulder. "Love between your peoples is possible, but it requires warriors who fight with hearts instead of weapons, who defeat hatred through understanding rather than victory through destruction." The eagle feather that Standing Bear had promised appeared in Apache Wind's vision, growing from a symbol of his father's approval into a representation of ancestral blessing that connected his love for Clara to the larger spiritual forces that shaped Apache destiny. When Apache Wind finally returned to consciousness in the physical world, the sun was rising on what would be the most important day of his life. His body was weak from 3 days without sustenance, but his spirit carried the certainty that came from divine confirmation of choices made in alignment with forces greater than human understanding. Standing Bear waited beside the cold ashes of the ceremonial fire, his expression unreadable, but his presence indicating that he'd maintained his own vigil throughout his son's trial. The eagle feather rested in his palm, ready to be bestowed if Apache Wind could demonstrate that he'd received the spiritual guidance the trial was designed to provide. "Tell me what you have seen," Standing Bear commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a chief, but also the concern of a father who'd watched his son risk everything for love. Apache Wind described his visions with the careful detail that proved their authenticity, revealing spiritual encounters that could only have occurred through genuine communion with ancestral wisdom. His account demonstrated not only the depth of his love for Clara, but also his understanding of the responsibilities that would come with their marriage. Standing Bear listened without interruption, his experienced judgment evaluating every detail of his son's report. When Apache Wind finished speaking, the chief rose and placed the sacred eagle feather in his son's hands, the gesture conveying both personal blessing and spiritual approval from the ancestors who'd witnessed the trial. "You have proven yourself worthy of the love you seek and the challenges it will bring," Standing Bear declared. This feather will remind you that your marriage serves purposes greater than personal happiness. You and Clara Whitman are being called to show both our peoples what becomes possible when love overcomes the fear that divides us. The eagle feather would accompany Apache Wind through the wedding ceremony that lay ahead, serving as proof that his love for Clara had been tested by the most sacred traditions of his people and found worthy of ancestral blessing. The trial that had begun in doubt now ended in certainty, though both father and son understood that the real tests of their commitment lay in the future that awaited them in a world still learning to accept love that transcended the boundaries of race and culture. The petition lay spread across the schoolhouse desk, its pages covered with signatures that represented nearly every family in Willowbrook and several from neighboring settlements who'd heard about the proposed Apache marriage. Sheriff Morrison's careful script had outlined the citizens' formal objections to what the document termed an unnatural union that threatens the moral foundation of our Christian community and sets a dangerous precedent for relations between civilized people and savage tribes. The schoolhouse had been chosen for the emergency town meeting because it was the only building large enough to accommodate the crowd that had gathered on this sweltering August evening. Kerosene lamps cast flickering shadows on the walls, where children's artwork usually brightened the space with drawings of flowers, houses, and families that reflected the simple hopes of frontier life. Tonight, those innocent decorations seemed like relics from a more peaceful time, before love had become a political issue that divided neighbors into opposing camps. Sheriff Morrison stood at the front of the room, his badge catching the lamplight, as he addressed the assembled citizens with the gravity of someone convinced he was protecting civilization itself from a threat that others were too naive or corrupted to recognize. We gather tonight as concerned members of a community that has always stood for Christian values and proper conduct between the races that God Himself has seen fit to separate. Morrison began, his voice carrying the authority of both legal office and moral conviction. Thomas Whitman's arrangement with the Apache may be legal under territorial law, but that doesn't make it right, and it doesn't mean we have to stand by and watch it happen. The crowd's response revealed the deep divisions that had been growing since news of the marriage arrangement first spread through town. Voices of agreement mixed with murmurs of dissent as neighbors who'd coexisted peacefully for years found themselves on opposite sides of a question that had no easy answers. Mrs. Helen Carpenter, her dress and demeanor reflecting the refined sensibilities of someone who'd never quite adjusted to frontier realities, rose from her seat in the front row. Sheriff Morrison speaks for all decent people when he says this marriage must be stopped. Clara Whitman is a young woman who's been manipulated by her father's desperate circumstances and possibly seduced by savage wiles that civilized people cannot hope to understand. And what gives us the right to make that judgment for her? Doc Hayes's voice cut through the murmur of approval that had followed Mrs. Carpenter's declaration. The doctor remained seated, but his words carried the weight of someone who'd earned respect through years of service to anyone who needed medical care, regardless of their race or social standing. The right of Christian people to protect one of our own from a fate worse than death. Johnny Fletcher replied, rising from his seat with the angry energy of a man whose romantic disappointment had transformed into self-righteous fury. Clara Whitman deserves better than being traded to savages like a piece of livestock. Father Gonzalez, who'd been listening quietly from his position near the back of the room, stood and walked toward the front with the measured pace of someone accustomed to mediating disputes that arose from fear and misunderstanding. My friends, I have performed marriages between people of different backgrounds, different languages, different traditions. Love does not recognize the boundaries that we create in our minds to separate ourselves from those who seem different from us. This isn't about love, Father Morrison interrupted, his voice rising with the passion of someone whose authority was being challenged.
This is about a financial transaction disguised as marriage, an arrangement that will bring nothing but shame to our community and possibly violence from Apache, who see this as evidence that white women can be obtained through negotiation rather than respect. Elizabeth Murphy, whose family had traded successfully with Apache for 20 years, stood with the confidence of someone whose experience gave weight to her opinions. Jake Morrison's been looking for trouble with the Apache since the day he pinned on that badge. This marriage could be the beginning of real peace between our peoples, but he'd rather see conflict because it justifies his fears and his prejudices. The debate that followed revealed the complex web of emotions, beliefs, and practical concerns that shaped frontier attitudes toward race and marriage. Some speakers focused on religious objections, citing biblical passages they interpreted as forbidding unions between different peoples. Others expressed economic concerns, worrying that acceptance of Apache white marriages would complicate trade relationships and property rights in ways that could destabilize the carefully negotiated peace that allowed both communities to prosper.
Miguel Sandoval, the Mexican trader whose establishment had facilitated Clara and Apache Wind's courtship, offered a perspective based on practical experience with cross-cultural relationships. His own marriage to an Apache woman had produced children who moved comfortably between both worlds while belonging fully to the new society that was emerging in the American Southwest. I have seen what happens when different peoples learn to live together as families rather than enemies, Miguel said, his accented English carrying the conviction of someone whose life proved the possibility he was describing. My children speak 3 languages, honor the best traditions of all their ancestors, and will build a future that none of us can imagine from our limited perspectives. Your children are the exception, not the rule, Mrs. Carpenter replied. Most mixed marriages end in tragedy, with children who belong nowhere and families torn apart by conflicts that can never be resolved. Carlos Santos, whose own family represented the successful integration of Mexican heritage into the American frontier community, stood to support Miguel's position. My grandmother was Apache, my grandfather Spanish, my father Mexican, and my children will be American. Each generation builds on what came before while creating something new. This is how countries are born, not through the separation that fear demands, but through the mixing that love makes possible. The petition that had motivated the meeting became the focus of increasingly heated debate as speakers argued about whether community opposition could legally prevent a marriage that satisfied territorial requirements. Morrison insisted that collective action by concerned citizens could pressure Thomas Whitman to reconsider his arrangement, while Doc Hayes warned that such pressure might constitute illegal interference with individual rights. Pete Davidson, whose saloon served as an unofficial community center where men gathered to discuss politics and current events, offered a pragmatic assessment of the situation that cut through the rhetorical arguments. The real question isn't whether we approve of this marriage. The real question is whether we're going to let our disapproval tear this community apart. The meeting continued for nearly 3 hours, with passions running high on both sides, but no clear resolution emerging from the democratic process that was supposed to provide guidance for community action. The petition remained on the desk, its signatures representing one measure of public opinion, but not necessarily the final word on how the marriage question would be resolved. As the evening wore on, and tempers frayed from the heat and tension, several disturbing suggestions emerged from the most militant opponents of the marriage. References to vigilante action, threats of violence against anyone who participated in the wedding ceremony, and dark hints about the fate that awaited Apache lovers revealed the dangerous undercurrent of hostility that had been building since the marriage was first announced. Sheriff Morrison made no effort to discourage such talk, his silence interpreted by some as tacit approval for extra legal measures that might succeed where legal opposition had failed. The petition in his possession would provide cover for actions that could be presented as community enforcement of moral standards rather than racial violence motivated by prejudice and fear. Doc Hayes and Father Gonzalez exchanged worried glances as they recognized the meeting's transformation from democratic debate into something more dangerous. The reasonable voices that had tried to counsel tolerance and understanding were being overwhelmed by the anger and fear that had been fermenting in the community since news of the marriage arrangement first spread. Mrs. Chen, whose Chinese heritage had made her a target of similar prejudice when she'd first arrived in Willowbrook, spoke quietly to Elizabeth Murphy about the familiar pattern of community hostility toward those who challenged social boundaries. Both women understood that Clara Whitman's situation represented a test of whether their community could live up to the principles of tolerance and individual freedom that supposedly defined American democracy. The meeting ended without formal resolution, but with clear lines drawn between those who would support the marriage and those who would oppose it through whatever means necessary. The petition would remain as evidence of community sentiment, but its ultimate significance would depend on how far the signers were willing to go in transforming their written objections into concrete action. As the citizens filed out into the warm night air, many understood that they had crossed a threshold from which there might be no peaceful return. The marriage between Clara Whitman and Apache Wind had become a symbol of larger questions about the future of their frontier community, and the answers to those questions would determine whether love or fear would shape the next chapter of their collective story. The wedding dress lay across Clara's bed like a white banner of surrender or victory, its faded satin surface bearing witness to 20 years of careful preservation since her mother Sarah had worn it on her own wedding day. Clara's fingers traced the delicate lace at the bodice, adding tiny Apache beadwork patterns that she had learned from studying designs at Miguel's trading post. Each silver and turquoise bead was sewn with the precision of someone transforming a symbol of one culture into a bridge between two worlds. The alteration work had taken 3 days of careful planning and meticulous execution, creating a garment that honored her mother's memory while acknowledging the Apache traditions she was preparing to join. The beadwork followed patterns that signified eternal love and spiritual protection, symbols that Apache Wind had taught her during their secret meetings when they dreamed of a future that seemed impossible but which was now only days away from becoming reality. Thomas sat in the kitchen, cleaning his rifle with the methodical attention of a man who understood that the weapon might be necessary to protect his daughter's wedding from the forces gathering to prevent it. The gun had belonged to his father, a Civil War veteran who'd carried it through battles that made frontier conflicts seem small by comparison. But the stakes of this confrontation felt just as high as any military campaign, with his daughter's happiness and possibly her life hanging in the balance. Word had reached the ranch that Sheriff Morrison was organizing what he called a peacekeeping force to prevent the Apache marriage from taking place. The euphemistic language couldn't disguise the reality that armed men were preparing to use violence to enforce their racial prejudices against a legal union between consenting adults. Thomas had never imagined that his attempt to save the ranch would lead to the possibility of bloodshed, but he was prepared to defend Clara's choice with his life if necessary. At the Apache encampment, warriors painted themselves with the traditional designs that prepared them for battle, while hoping that their preparations would prove unnecessary. The paints carried spiritual significance that went beyond their practical function of intimidating enemies, connecting each warrior to ancestors who had fought to protect their people's freedom and dignity. Apache Wind watched his friend Running Wolf apply the black and red patterns that marked him as a proven warrior, understanding that tomorrow's ceremony would test more than just the love between two individuals. It would determine whether the Apache could successfully integrate with settler society, or whether the old patterns of violence and separation would reassert themselves despite years of peaceful coexistence. "Are you ready for what may come?" Running Wolf asked, his voice muffled by the concentration required for precise paint application. "I'm ready to marry the woman I love and defend our right to make that choice," Apache Wind replied, though he understood that readiness was different from confidence in the outcome. The forces gathering against them represented generations of fear and hatred that wouldn't be easily overcome by reason or even by force. Standing Bear had spent the day in council with other Apache leaders, discussing strategies for protecting the wedding ceremony without provoking the kind of violent confrontation that could destroy the fragile peace both communities had worked to maintain. The chief understood that his son's marriage had become a test of Apache strength and resolve that went far beyond personal happiness. If we show weakness, they will see it as invitation to push us further. Standing Bear explained to the assembled warriors, if we show too much strength, they will claim we are threatening their community and use that as excuse for retaliation. We must find the path that protects our people's honor while not giving our enemies the war they seem to want. The Apache preparations included more than just military readiness. Traditional wedding ceremonies required specific rituals and sacred objects that needed to be prepared according to customs that had been followed for generations. The marriage between Apache Wind and Clara would incorporate both Apache and white traditions, creating a ceremony that honored both cultures while establishing precedents for future unions between their peoples. Moon Shadow, the respected woman elder who had known Apache Wind's mother, supervised the preparation of traditional Apache wedding gifts and ceremonial items. The work required knowledge of ancient customs combined with adaptation to the unique circumstances of a cross-cultural marriage that had no exact precedent in Apache tradition. This wedding will be remembered long after we are gone, Moon Shadow explained to the younger women who assisted with preparations. Everything we do must honor our ancestors while showing respect for the white woman who is joining our family. The ceremonies must be perfect so that no one can say we failed to treat this union with the seriousness it deserves. In town, the opposition forces were making their own preparations with the grim efficiency of men convinced they were protecting civilization from barbarism. Sheriff Morrison had recruited volunteers from surrounding settlements, creating a force that outnumbered the Apache warriors but lacked their cohesion and fighting experience. Johnny Fletcher had emerged as one of Morrison's most vocal supporters, his romantic disappointment having transformed into the kind of rage that made him dangerous to both sides. His father's livery stable had become an unofficial headquarters for the anti-marriage faction, where weapons were cleaned and strategies discussed with the passion of men preparing for a holy war. Clara Whitman doesn't know what she's getting into, Johnny declared to anyone who would listen. Someone needs to save her from herself, even if she doesn't want to be saved. The dangerous logic of men who claim to protect women by denying them choices had been building momentum since the town meeting, fed by fears and prejudices that transformed love into a threat that required violent suppression. Doc Hayes and Father Gonzalez had formed their own alliance, working quietly to build support for tolerance and peaceful resolution of the crisis. The doctor had treated both Apache and white patients for years, earning respect that transcended racial boundaries. The priest had performed marriages that crossed cultural lines, understanding that love could bridge differences that politics and prejudice seemed determined to maintain. This is about more than one wedding, Doc Hayes explained to Elizabeth Murphy and the other merchants who depended on peaceful relations with the Apache for their economic survival. If we allow fear to drive us into violence, we'll destroy everything that makes this community worth preserving. Miguel Sandoval had closed his trading post and moved his family to safety, understanding that his position as mediator between the communities made him a target for extremists on both sides. But he'd also sent word to both Apache and white leaders that his establishment would serve as neutral ground for any last-minute negotiations that might prevent bloodshed. The preparations on both sides created a momentum toward confrontation that seemed increasingly difficult to stop through peaceful means. Each group's efforts to protect themselves were interpreted by their opponents as evidence of aggressive intentions, creating the kind of misunderstanding that had sparked conflicts throughout frontier history. Clara spent the evening before her wedding writing letters to friends and family members who wouldn't be attending the ceremony,
explaining her choices and expressing hope that time would heal the divisions that her marriage had revealed. The letters served as both explanation and potential farewell, acknowledging the possibility that tomorrow's events might separate her permanently from the community where she'd grown up. Dearest cousin Sarah in St. Louis, Clara wrote by lamplight, her pen moving slowly across paper that might carry her last words to the relatives who'd been shocked by news of her engagement to an Apache warrior. I know you cannot understand my choice, but I hope someday you will see that love is the same, whether it crosses oceans or just the boundaries that men create to separate themselves from those they fear. The wedding dress waited in silent testimony to her determination to proceed with the ceremony, regardless of the opposition it had generated. The beadwork she'd added caught the lamplight like small stars, bridging the gap between her mother's dreams and her own vision of a future that honored both heritage and heart. As midnight approached, both sides completed their preparations for a confrontation that everyone hoped could be avoided, but which seemed increasingly inevitable. The wedding that was supposed to celebrate love had become a test of whether two communities could live together peacefully, or whether the old patterns of fear and violence would destroy the progress that years of cooperation had achieved. The morning would bring answers to questions that had been building since the day Thomas Whitman first tamper with a proposal that seemed simple, but which had revealed the complex web of prejudice, hope, and human longing that shaped life on the frontier where different worlds sing. They sung the ceremonial blanket. At the center of the wedding circle,
It's carved and old. Apache Wind waited beside the ceremonial fire in traditional Apache wedding attire that had been worn by generations of his ancestors, but with additions that acknowledged Clara's heritage. Silver conchos that had been traded from Mexican craftsmen decorated his shirt, while the eagle feather from his father's blessing was woven into a headband that also included white ribbons representing the peace he hoped their union would help create. The wedding ceremony had been carefully planned to incorporate elements from both Apache and Christian traditions, creating a ritual that honored both cultures while establishing new precedents for cross-cultural unions. Father Gonzalez had worked with Apache spiritual leaders to develop a service that satisfied the religious requirements of both communities while respecting the sacred nature of marriage in all traditions. Standing Bear and Thomas Whitman stood together as the fathers, giving their blessing to a union that had begun as a practical arrangement but had become something deeper and more significant than either had originally imagined. The presence of both men represented not just parental approval but the possibility of cooperation between peoples who had been enemies long enough to forget why they had started fighting. The ceremony began before dawn with Apache purification rituals that prepared the participants for the sacred act of marriage. Clara had learned the basic elements of these ceremonies during her secret courtship with Apache Wind, understanding that becoming his wife meant accepting spiritual responsibilities that went beyond personal happiness to include service to the larger community. Great Spirit, we gather in the place where waters meet to witness the joining of two hearts that represent the hope of all our peoples, the Apache medicine man began, his words translated by Miguel Sandoval so that both communities could understand the significance of what was taking place. The early morning ceremony proceeded peacefully, with representatives from both communities participating in rituals that emphasized unity, respect, and the sacred nature of commitments made in the presence of divine witnesses. The peace pipe was passed among the participants, each person offering prayers for the couple's happiness and for the continued cooperation between their peoples. But as the sun climbed higher and the formal ceremony moved toward its conclusion, the sound of approaching horses announced the arrival of Sheriff Morrison and his armed supporters. The group rode into the clearing with the aggressive confidence of men convinced they were preventing a crime rather than disrupting a legal wedding ceremony. "This ceremony stops now," Morrison declared, his badge glinting in the sunlight as he positioned his horse between Clara and Apache Wind. I have a petition signed by the decent citizens of Willowbrook demanding that this unnatural union be prevented for the protection of our community's moral standards. Apache warriors immediately moved to defensive positions around the wedding circle, their painted faces and traditional weapons creating a formidable barrier between the ceremony and Morrison's armed men. The careful planning for peaceful celebration was instantly transformed into preparation for the violent confrontation that everyone had hoped to avoid. "Sheriff Morrison, you have no legal authority to stop this ceremony," Father Gonzalez declared, stepping forward with the moral authority of his religious office. "This marriage satisfies all territorial requirements and has been properly witnessed by representatives of both communities. I have the authority of concerned citizens who refuse to watch their community be contaminated by savage influences," Morrison replied, his hand resting on his pistol in a gesture that made his intentions clear. "Clara Whitman is being coerced into this arrangement, and I'm here to offer her the protection her own father has failed to provide." The confrontation that had been building for weeks finally erupted as Johnny Fletcher and several other young men pushed forward, their romantic disappointment and racial hatred combining into the kind of rage that made violence seem inevitable. "Clara belongs with her own people," Johnny shouted, drawing his weapon and pointing it at Apache Wind. "She's been bewitched by savage magic, and someone needs to break the spell before it's too late." The wedding clearing erupted in controlled chaos as Apache warriors responded to the threat against their chief's son, while trying to avoid escalating the confrontation into the kind of bloodbath that would destroy years of peaceful coexistence. Standing Bear's calm voice cut through the tension with the authority of someone accustomed to preventing conflicts from spiraling beyond control. "Lower your weapons, all of you. This is a place of sacred ceremony, not a battlefield. Anyone who sheds blood here dishonors themselves and their people." But Morrison's group had not come to be reasoned with, and the sheriff's next words revealed the extent of the conspiracy that had been building against the marriage. "We have legal papers declaring Clara Whitman mentally incompetent to make marriage decisions due to coercion and possibly drug-induced hallucinations caused by Apache witchcraft," Morrison announced, producing documents that had obviously been prepared in advance. "She's coming with us for her own protection, and anyone who interferes will be charged with kidnapping and conspiracy." The fraudulent legal documents represented a new level of opposition that went beyond community pressure into the realm of official corruption, designed to use the law as a weapon against love that crossed racial boundaries. Doc Hayes immediately stepped forward to challenge the legitimacy of any mental competency declaration that had been made without proper medical examination. "Those papers are worthless, Jake. Clara Whitman is as sane as anyone here, and probably more so than men who think they can use fake legal documents to kidnap a woman from her own wedding." The standoff intensified as both sides realized that compromise was no longer possible. Morrison's group had come too far and revealed too much of their true intentions to back down without losing face, while the Apache couldn't allow such an insult to their honor and their sacred ceremonies to go unanswered. Clara herself stepped into the center of the confrontation, her white wedding dress making her a striking figure as she positioned herself between the two armed groups that were preparing for violence in her name. "I am Clara Whitman," she declared, her voice carrying across the clearing with surprising strength. "I am 19 years old, of sound mind, and perfectly capable of choosing my own husband. These men claim to protect me while denying me the basic right to make my own decisions about love and marriage." She looked directly at Johnny Fletcher and the other young men who had once courted her, her expression mixing sadness with determination. "Johnny, you say you care about me, but caring means respecting my choices, even when you don't understand them. Apache Wind and I chose each other months ago, long before our fathers made their arrangement. This isn't coercion or witchcraft. This is love." Clara then turned to Sheriff Morrison, her voice taking on the edge of someone whose patience had been exhausted by willful misunderstanding. "Sheriff, You claim legal authority, but the only law being broken here is your interference with a legal ceremony. Your petition represents the fears and prejudices of people who judge others by the color of their skin rather than the content of their character. The peace pipe at the center of the ceremonial circle seemed to glow in the morning sunlight, its symbolic power intensified by the confrontation swirling around it. The sacred object represented everything that was at stake in this moment: the possibility of peace between peoples, the power of love to overcome hatred, and the choice between hope and fear that would determine the future of both communities. Apache Wind moved to stand beside Clara, taking her hand in a gesture that declared their unity regardless of the opposition they faced. "We are married in the eyes of the Great Spirit and in the laws of this territory," Apache Wind said, his English clear and strong despite the emotion of the moment. "No petition, no false papers, no weapons can change that truth." The moment of decision had arrived, with both sides understanding that the next few minutes would determine whether love could survive the test of hatred, whether peace could be maintained in the face of those who preferred the familiar patterns of conflict and separation. The peace pipe waited in the center of it all, ready to seal the union. It was designed to bless or to become a witness to the violence that fear could unleash when it refused to make room for hope. The white flag fluttered in the desert breeze, torn from Clara's wedding dress and tied to Apache Wind's coup stick by her own trembling hands as she stood in the narrow space between two groups of armed men whose hatred threatened to destroy everything she and Apache Wind had built together. The makeshift banner of truce represented her desperate attempt to prevent the bloodshed that would make their love story a tragedy, remembered for all the wrong reasons. "Please," Clara called out, her voice carrying across the tense silence that had fallen over the wedding clearing. "Look at what we're doing. Look at how fear has made us forget everything we claim to believe about love, family, and the value of human life." The torn white fabric caught the morning sunlight, its pristine surface now marked with dust, and the tears that Clara hadn't realized were streaming down her face. The symbolic power of her gesture, literally giving up pieces of her wedding dress to prevent violence, created a moment of pause that allowed reason to compete with rage in the hearts of men who had come prepared for war. Sheriff Morrison's hand remained on his pistol, but Clara's words had created doubt where certainty had existed moments before. The young woman standing between the opposing forces bore little resemblance to the helpless victim he'd convinced himself he was rescuing from savage captivity. Her strength and clarity challenged the fundamental assumptions that had justified his aggressive intervention. "Clara, you don't understand what you're saying," Johnny Fletcher protested, his voice revealing the desperation of someone whose romantic fantasy was crumbling under the weight of reality. "These people have twisted your mind, made you think you want something that no decent woman would choose for herself." "Johnny, the only thing twisted here is your belief that you have the right to make my choices for me," Clara replied, her patience finally exhausted by months of condescending concern from men who claimed to know her heart better than she did. "I've known Apache Wind for 6 months. I've learned his language, studied his customs, and chosen to spend my life with him because he treats me as an equal partner rather than property to be protected." Apache Wind stepped forward, positioning himself beside Clara while keeping his weapons lowered in a gesture that demonstrated strength without aggression. His presence beside the white flag created a powerful image of two people united against the forces that sought to divide them. "We do not want war," Apache Wind said, his English carefully measured to ensure that every word was understood by both sides. "We want only the right to love each other and build a life that honors both our peoples. If that requires us to stand against those who would use violence to enforce their hatred, we will do so together." Standing Bear watched his son with the conflicted emotions of a father who was proud of Apache Wind's courage, but terrified by the consequences that such courage might bring. The chief had fought enough battles to recognize the moment when peaceful resolution became impossible, when the momentum of anger and fear overwhelmed the voices of reason and restraint. Sheriff Morrison, Standing Bear called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "You came here with papers you claim give you the right to take this woman from her chosen husband. But what right do you have to bring armed men into a sacred ceremony and threaten violence against people who have broken no law?" Morrison's response revealed the depth of his commitment to preventing the marriage, regardless of legal niceties or moral considerations. "I have the right of every Christian man to protect our community from contamination by savage influences. This woman has been bewitched or coerced, and I won't stand by while she destroys herself and dishonors every decent family in our territory." The fraudulent nature of Morrison's legal authority became clear when Doc Hayes stepped forward with genuine medical credentials and a lifetime of credibility in treating both Apache and white patients. "Jake, I've known Clara Whitman since the day she was born, and I've never seen her more clear-headed or sure of herself than she is right now," Doc Hayes declared. "Your papers are worthless, your authority is fake, and your interference here is the only illegal activity taking place today." Father Gonzalez joined Doc Hayes in the space beside the white flag, his clerical collar providing moral authority that competed with Morrison's claims to represent Christian values. "Sheriff Morrison claims to act in God's name, but I see no godliness in using weapons to prevent a legal marriage between two people who love each other," the priest said. "The Christ I serve taught us to love our neighbors as ourselves, not to hate them because they look different or follow different customs." The standoff intensified as more voices joined the debate, with members of both communities forced to choose between the path of tolerance and the familiar comfort of prejudice. Elizabeth Murphy stepped forward with several other merchants who depended on peaceful trade relationships with the Apache, their economic interests aligning with their moral convictions about individual rights. "This marriage could be the beginning of a new era of cooperation between our peoples," Elizabeth declared. "But if we allow fear and hatred to drive us into violence, we'll destroy everything that makes our community worth preserving." Miguel Sandoval emerged from the crowd, carrying the actual legal documents that proved Clara and Apache Wind's marriage met all territorial requirements. His position as neutral mediator, lending weight to his testimony about the ceremony's legitimacy. "I have witnessed many marriages between different peoples," Miguel announced. "Love does not recognize the boundaries that politics creates. This union is legal, blessed by both Apache and Christian traditions, and supported by families who have chosen cooperation over conflict." But Morrison's supporters were not swayed by appeals to law or morality, their racial hatred too deep to be overcome by reasonable argument. Pete Davidson raised his rifle toward Apache Wind, his action triggering immediate response from Apache warriors who moved to protect their chief's son. "Enough talking," Pete shouted. "Clara Whitman is coming with us whether she wants to or not. This savage witchcraft ends here." The moment of maximum danger had arrived, with weapons drawn on both sides and the smallest provocation capable of starting a battle that would leave families shattered and communities destroyed. The white flag that Clara held seemed pitifully small against the forces of hatred and fear that threatened to overwhelm everything she and Apache Wind had worked to build. But in that moment of crisis, an unexpected voice cut through the tension with the moral authority that could still prevent disaster. Thomas Whitman stepped forward, his rifle in his hands but pointed toward the ground rather than at any of the men who had come to disrupt his daughter's wedding. "This stops now," Thomas declared, his voice carrying the weight of a father's love and a man's determination to protect what mattered most. "Clara is my daughter, and she has my blessing to marry the man she has chosen. Anyone who wants to take her from her wedding will have to go through me first." The dramatic intervention by Clara's own father transformed the dynamics of the confrontation, forcing Morrison's supporters to confront the reality that they were opposing not just Apache customs, but the wishes of the white family they claimed to be protecting.
The white flag continued to flutter in Clara's hands, its torn fabric representing both the fragility of peace and the power of love to create symbols of hope, even in the darkest moments. The next few minutes would determine whether that hope could survive the test of hatred that had gathered in the sacred space where two hearts had planned to become one. The love letters lay scattered across the ceremonial blanket like fallen leaves, their pages yellowed with age and handling, each one bearing witness to a relationship that had grown from curious attraction into deep commitment through months of secret correspondence. Doc Hayes had produced them from his medical bag, with the gravity of someone presenting evidence that could either save lives or condemn them, understanding that the written words of two lovers might be the only thing powerful enough to prevent the bloodshed that seemed moments away. I've been carrying these letters between Clara and Apache Wind for 6 months, Doc Hayes announced to the assembled crowd, his voice carrying the moral authority that came from decades of serving both communities without regard to race or politics. Every person here needs to understand that this isn't a forced marriage or a political arrangement. This is the culmination of a love story that began long before their fathers ever discussed trading horses. Clara felt her face flush with embarrassment and pride as the doctor began reading excerpts from their correspondence, private thoughts and feelings now exposed to the judgment of people who had come to prevent her wedding. But she also recognized that their love letters might be the only evidence capable of proving that her marriage was a choice freely made, rather than a coercion imposed by desperate circumstances. My dearest Clara, Doc Hayes read from one of Apache Wind's earliest letters, his accented voice lending dignity to words that had been written in the flickering light of evening campfires. Today I watched a hawk teaching her young to hunt, and I thought of how you are teaching me to see the world through eyes that recognize no boundaries between peoples who were meant to live as neighbors rather than enemies. Sheriff Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his saddle as the letters revealed a relationship that contradicted every assumption he'd made about the marriage he'd come to prevent.
The correspondence showed not a naive white woman seduced by savage wiles, but two intelligent adults who had carefully considered the challenges they would face while choosing love over the safety of staying within their own communities. Apache Wind understands more about what it means to be a good husband than most of the white men I've known. Clara's voice rang clear in one letter that Doc Hayes selected for its directness. He asks my opinions about everything, treats my thoughts as valuable, and never assumes that his desires are more important than mine, simply because he's a man. Johnny Fletcher's face darkened with rage as he listened to Clara's written praise for qualities that he'd never thought to offer during his own clumsy attempts at courtship. The letters revealed a depth of communication and mutual respect that challenged his assumptions about what women wanted from marriage and what men should provide. Running Wolf stepped forward from among the Apache observers, adding his testimony to the evidence that Doc Hayes was presenting. I have watched my friend Apache Wind during these months of secret meetings. I have seen how Clara Whitman's letters made him smile, how her words gave him hope for a future that seemed impossible to most of our people. The letters chronicled not just romantic attachment, but serious discussions about the practical challenges of cross-cultural marriage. Clara had written detailed questions about Apache customs, family structures, and spiritual beliefs, demonstrating a genuine commitment to understanding the world she was choosing to enter. Apache Wind had responded with equal seriousness, explaining traditions while also acknowledging the ways that their union would require adaptation on both sides. We know this won't be easy, one of Clara's letters read. People in both our communities will question our choices and judge our children. But I believe that love which faces such challenges honestly is stronger than love that never has to prove itself. Father Gonzalez took several of the letters and read passages that dealt with spiritual questions, showing how Clara and Apache Wind had worked to understand each other's religious beliefs while finding common ground in their shared commitment to values that transcended cultural boundaries. Clara writes about attending Apache ceremonies and finding spiritual truth that speaks to her heart, Father Gonzalez explained. Apache Wind writes about Christian teachings that align with Apache wisdom about treating all people with respect and dignity. These are not the words of people who are abandoning their faiths, but of two souls who are finding ways to honor both their traditions. The love letters created a powerful counter-narrative to the story that Morrison's supporters had constructed about naive white womanhood and dangerous Apache masculinity. The correspondence revealed Clara as an active participant in shaping their relationship rather than a passive victim of circumstances beyond her control. Miguel Sandoval added his own testimony about the meetings he had witnessed and facilitated at his trading post, describing conversations between Clara and Apache Wind that had impressed him with their maturity and mutual consideration. "I have seen many marriages between different peoples," Miguel said. "Some are arranged for practical reasons, some are driven by passion that burns quickly and dies. But this love has grown slowly, tested by obstacles, strengthened by honest communication. This is the kind of marriage that lasts." Even some of Morrison's supporters began to waver as the evidence mounted that their intervention was based on false assumptions about the relationship they had come to destroy. The letters made it impossible to maintain the fiction that Clara was a helpless victim who needed rescue from her own poor judgment. Mrs. Carpenter, who had been one of the most vocal opponents of the marriage, listened to the letters with growing discomfort as they revealed a woman making informed, thoughtful decisions about her future rather than the confused girl she had imagined. "I still don't approve," Mrs. Carpenter said quietly, "but I can see that Clara knows her own mind better than I gave her credit for." The letters also revealed the depth of sacrifice that both Clara and Apache Wind had been willing to make for their love. Clara had written about her fears of losing her father's approval and her sadness at the possibility of being rejected by the community where she'd grown up. Apache Wind had expressed similar concerns about disappointing his father and potentially being cast out by tribal members who viewed any connection to white society as betrayal. "We are both giving up the easy path," one letter read, "but we are gaining something that neither of us could find alone, a love that is strong enough to create a bridge between two worlds that have been separated by fear for too long." As Doc Hayes finished reading the most powerful excerpts from their correspondence, a new understanding seemed to settle over the crowd that had gathered to witness what they'd expected to be either a wedding or a battle. The letters had humanized the conflict, showing that the abstract questions about race and culture involved real people whose feelings deserved respect, even from those who disagreed with their choices. Sheriff Morrison found his authority undermined by evidence that he had fundamentally misunderstood the situation he had come to resolve. The fraudulent legal papers in his possession seemed pathetic compared to the authentic documentation of a relationship that had grown through honest communication and mutual respect. "These letters prove nothing," Morrison said weakly, but his voice lacked the conviction that had driven him to organize armed opposition to the marriage. "A woman can be fooled by pretty words written by someone who knows how to manipulate her emotions." But the crowd was no longer listening to Morrison's objections with the same receptiveness they had shown earlier. The love letters had created doubt where certainty had existed, opening space for the possibility that love between different peoples might be not only acceptable but admirable in its courage and honesty. Clara took Apache Wind's hand and stepped forward, ready to speak for herself now that the truth about their relationship had been revealed to everyone who had presumed to judge it without understanding it. "These letters represent 6 months of learning to love someone not despite our differences, but because of the ways those differences make us stronger together than either of us could be alone," Clara declared. "Apache Wind and I chose each other with full knowledge of the challenges we would face. No one forced this choice on us, and no one has the right to prevent us from living with the consequences of our decision." The love letters had done what arguments and threats could not accomplish.
They had revealed the human reality behind the political symbols, showing that love could indeed cross the boundaries that fear had created between peoples who shared the same hopes for happiness, security, and meaning in their lives. The two rings rested side by side on Thomas Whitman's weathered palm, catching the morning sunlight in flashes of gold and turquoise that seemed to bridge the gap between two worlds that had been kept apart by fear and misunderstanding for too long. His late wife Sarah's simple gold wedding band lay beside the Apache ring that Apache Wind had given to Clara, their different styles and origins representing the choice that Thomas now faced between honoring his daughter's happiness and protecting the racial boundaries that had defined frontier society since the first settlers arrived. Thomas stared at the rings while the crowd waited in tense silence, understanding that his decision would determine not only Clara's fate, but the future relationship between their communities. As Clara's father, his approval or condemnation would carry weight that no legal document or community petition could match. The love letters had revealed the depth of his daughter's commitment, but they had also forced him to confront the reality that she had chosen a path he had never imagined possible. 45 years ago, I fell in love with a woman my own father said I couldn't marry, Thomas began, his voice carrying across the clearing with the weight of memory and hard-earned wisdom. Sarah Murphy was Irish Catholic, and I was Protestant American. My father said the differences were too great, that such a marriage would bring nothing but trouble to both families. Clara looked at her father with surprise, having never heard this story about her parents' courtship. The revelation that Thomas himself had faced opposition to his choice of bride added new complexity to his position on her marriage to Apache Wind. I defied my father and married Sarah anyway, and for 20 years we built a life together that proved love could overcome the prejudices that small minds use to justify their fear of anyone different from themselves. Thomas continued, his eyes never leaving the two rings that represented past and future, tradition and change. Standing Bear listened to Thomas's story with the respect that one father owes another when discussing the challenges of protecting children while allowing them to choose their own paths. The Apache chief understood that this moment would test Thomas's commitment to the principles he claimed to value, forcing him to choose between personal comfort and his daughter's happiness. But I also know the price that such choices demand, Thomas said, his voice growing heavier with the burden of experience. Sarah and I faced years of hostility from people who couldn't accept our marriage. Some of our children might have been born dead because of the stress that constant opposition placed on their mother. We lost friends, family members, and opportunities because we refused to conform to other people's expectations. Clara felt her heart sink as she heard doubt creeping into her father's voice, fearing that his own difficult experience would make him unwilling to support her choice to marry Apache Wind. But she also understood that he was sharing his story, not to discourage her shared so that she understood me. That he understood the full implications, the full implications of the past he had took.
The question I must answer today is whether I believe my daughter is strong enough to face those same challenges, whether her love is deep enough to sustain her through the difficulties that will come, Thomas said, looking directly at Clara for the first time since beginning his speech. Apache Wind stepped forward, offering to remove himself from the situation if his presence was causing Clara to lose her father's love and support. The gesture demonstrated the selfless nature of his commitment, his willingness to sacrifice his own happiness rather than see Clara torn between love and family loyalty. Mr. Whitman, if my marriage to Clara will cost her your blessing, I will leave now and never return, Apache Wind said, his English clear and strong, despite the emotion of the moment. I love her too much to be the cause of separation between father and daughter. Thomas studied the young Apache warrior who had won his daughter's heart, seeing strength and honor that transcended racial boundaries. Apache Wind's offer to sacrifice his own happiness for Clara's relationship with her father demonstrated the kind of character that Thomas had hoped to find in any man who sought to marry his daughter. "No, son," Thomas replied, using the term of affection deliberately and publicly. "You won't be leaving, and Clara won't be choosing between her father and her husband. I've seen enough of your character through these past weeks to know that you'll take better care of my daughter than most of the white men who've come calling." The crowd stirred at Thomas's use of son to address Apache Wind, understanding that the word represented formal acceptance of the marriage and recognition of Apache Wind as a member of the Whitman family. The simple term carried more legal and social weight than any document or ceremony. Thomas picked up both rings and examined them more closely, seeing in their different styles a representation of the cultural blending that his daughter's marriage would represent. "Sarah's ring represents the life she and I built together against the odds," Thomas said. "Apache Wind's ring represents the future that Clara has chosen for herself. Together, they symbolize the truth that love is stronger than the boundaries that fear creates between people who should be neighbors rather than enemies." He handed both rings to Clara, the gesture representing his blessing of her choice to honor both her heritage and her heart in the marriage she was about to complete. "I give you both rings as symbols of the love that has shaped your life and the love that will define your future," Thomas said. "Wear them together as proof that it's possible to honor the past while embracing change, to respect tradition while creating something new." Clara slipped both rings onto her finger, the gold and silver, the diamonds and turquoise, creating a visual representation of the cultural bridge she and Apache Wind were building through their marriage. The combined rings caught the sunlight and seemed to glow with inner fire, transforming personal jewelry into symbols of hope for everyone who witnessed their union. Sheriff Morrison made one final attempt to prevent the marriage, drawing his weapon and pointing it at Apache Wind with the desperate determination of someone whose authority and worldview were crumbling before his eyes. "This is wrong," Morrison declared. "Thomas Whitman, you're condemning your daughter to a life of degradation among savages. Someone has to stop this madness before it destroys our entire community." But Morrison found himself facing not just Apache warriors, but members of his own community who had been moved by the evidence of genuine love and authentic commitment that had been revealed through the morning's events. Doc Hayes, Father Gonzalez, Elizabeth Murphy, and even some of Morrison's own supporters stepped forward to stand with the wedding party, their presence creating a human barrier between the sheriff's hatred and the love he sought to destroy. "Jake, you're done here," Doc Hayes said firmly. "This marriage is legal, blessed by both families, and supported by everyone with sense enough to recognize love when they see it. Put down your gun and go home before you do something that ruins more lives than it saves." The moral authority of the community had shifted, isolating Morrison and his most militant supporters while creating a protective circle around Clara and Apache Wind that represented the triumph of tolerance over prejudice, love over fear. Thomas took his place beside his daughter and her chosen husband, his presence serving as the final seal of approval on a marriage that had begun as practical arrangement but had become a symbol of hope for the future relationship between Apache and white communities. "The choice has been made," Thomas declared to the crowd. "Clara has chosen love over fear, hope over hatred. As her father, I choose to support her decision and welcome Apache Wind into our family as the son-in-law he has already proven himself to be through his devotion to my daughter's happiness." The two rings on Clara's finger caught the sunlight and seemed to send signals of peace across the crowd that had gathered to witness either a wedding or a battle. Love had won the first victory, but everyone understood that the real test of their commitment would come in the years ahead as they worked to build a life together that honored both their heritage and their hopes. The treaty document lay spread across the wooden table in Miguel Sandoval's trading post, its formal language creating a bridge between two communities that had nearly destroyed each other over questions of love and racial boundaries that morning. The agreement had been drafted hastily by Doc Hayes and Father Gonzalez, with input from both Thomas Whitman and Standing Bear, creating a framework for peaceful coexistence that would protect not only Clara and Apache Wind's marriage, but future unions between Apache and settler families. The ceremony had concluded successfully despite Sheriff Morrison's interference, with Clara and Apache Wind exchanging vows in both Apache and Christian traditions, while their families and supporters formed a protective circle around them. The peace pipe had been passed among representatives of both communities, sealing promises of mutual respect and cooperation that transformed a potential battlefield into sacred ground where love had triumphed over hatred. Morrison and his most militant supporters had retreated after finding themselves outnumbered not by Apache warriors, but by members of their own community who had chosen tolerance over prejudice. The sheriff's moral authority had evaporated when faced with evidence that his opposition to the marriage was based on racism rather than legitimate concerns about law and order. This agreement establishes Miguel's trading post as neutral ground, where disputes between our communities can be resolved through discussion rather than violence. Doc Hayes explained as community leaders from both sides gathered to formalize the peace that Clara and Apache Wind's wedding had created. It also provides legal protections for intermarriage and guarantees that children from such unions will have full rights in both communities. Standing Bear studied the document with the careful attention of someone who understood that treaties were only as strong as the commitment of the people who signed them. The Apache chief had seen enough broken promises to be cautious about any agreement that depended on white settlers honoring their word. But he also recognized that this treaty emerged from genuine cooperation rather than the coercion that had characterized most government negotiations with his people. "These words are good," Standing Bear said through Miguel's translation, "but words on paper mean nothing if the hearts that speak them are not committed to peace. My people will honor this agreement as long as your people do the same." Thomas signed the document with the same steady hand he'd used to engineer bridges and survey boundaries during his career, understanding that he was helping to build something more important than any physical structure. The treaty represented his daughter's security and the possibility that her children would grow up in a world where love was stronger than the artificial divisions that had kept peoples apart. Father Gonzalez added his signature and the blessing of the church, creating religious sanction for cross-cultural marriages that would help protect future couples from the kind of persecution that Clara and Apache Wind had faced. The priest understood that official church support would be crucial in changing attitudes among settlers who used religion to justify their racial prejudices. The wedding celebration that followed the treaty signing brought together Apache and white families in ways that had seemed impossible just hours earlier. Clara had changed from her torn wedding dress into simpler clothes that allowed her to move freely among both communities, accepting congratulations and building relationships that would support her marriage in the years ahead. Apache Wind wore both his traditional Apache clothing and elements of settler fashion, his mixed attire reflecting the cultural bridge he was helping to build through his marriage to Clara. The combination looked natural rather than forced, suggesting that blending different traditions could create something new and beautiful, rather than simply diluting what had existed before. The food served at the celebration included dishes from both cultures, with Apache women contributing traditional recipes, while settler women provided familiar favorites. The sharing of meals created opportunities for conversation and connection that broke down barriers more effectively than any formal agreement could accomplish. Elizabeth Murphy found herself discussing gardening techniques with Apache women who had generations of experience growing crops in desert conditions. The exchange of practical knowledge created friendships that would outlast any political tensions that might arise in the future. Miguel's children,
who represented the successful integration of Apache Mexican and American heritage, served as living proof that cultural blending could produce strong, confident young people who belonged fully to the emerging society of the Southwest. Their presence at the celebration offered hope for children that Clara and Apache Wind might have together. Johnny Fletcher made a grudging appearance. The celebration, his romantic disappointment, gradually giving way to acceptance of Clara's choice. The young man's ability to set aside his personal feelings for the good of community peace demonstrated the kind of maturity that a treaty to succeed. I still don't understand how you could choose him over me, Johnny said quietly to Clara during a moment when they found themselves standing together at the edge of the celebration. But I can see that he makes you happy in ways I never could have. Clara's response showed the wisdom she had gained and warmth of defending her choices against community opposition. Johnny, you wanted me to fit into the life you had planned for yourself. Apache Wind wants to build a life together that makes both of us stronger than we could be alone. The horses that are waiting in order to Thomas is away from telling that they're injured and then forward. The thing about the situation was that they don't want to see but to the life, but they got the power,
But the animals now represented much more than a business transaction. They symbolized the trust that had developed between two families who had chosen cooperation over conflict. Running Wolf presented Clara with a traditional Apache wedding gift, a beautifully crafted basket that had been made by the women of the tribe as a symbol of her acceptance into their community. The gift carried spiritual significance beyond its practical value, representing Clara's new status as an Apache daughter who would be protected and supported by her husband's people. Doc Hayes took advantage of the celebration to announce his intention to establish a medical practice that would serve both communities, with Apache healers and white doctors working together to combine traditional and modern approaches to healthcare. The collaboration would provide another model for the kind of cooperation that the treaty was designed to encourage. As evening approached and the formal celebration began to wind down, Clara and Apache Wind found themselves standing together at the edge of the clearing where they had been married, watching the sun set over the landscape they would share as husband and wife. The challenges ahead remained significant, but they had proven that love could survive the test of hatred and fear. "Do you think it will work?" Clara asked, her hand resting in Apache Wind's as they looked toward a future that no one could predict with certainty. "Love always works if the people who share it are willing to fight for it," Apache Wind replied. "We've already proven that we're stronger together than anyone expected. The rest is just living up to the promises we made today." The treaty document remained in Miguel's safe, waiting to be tested by whatever challenges the future would bring. But the real foundation of peace lay not in written agreements, but in the relationships that had been built through the courage of two young people who had chosen love over the comfortable safety of staying within the boundaries that others had created for them. The celebration continued into the night, with music and dancing that combined Apache and settler traditions in ways that created something entirely new. Children from both communities played together without the suspicion and fear that had separated their parents, offering hope that the next generation would build on the foundation of understanding that Clara and Apache Wind's wedding had established. The treaty that formalized their community's commitment to peaceful coexistence would be remembered as an important document in the history of the Southwest, but the love story that had inspired it would be remembered longer, proving that some bridges between different worlds are built, not with law and politics, but with the simple courage to love, without limits. The seed packet rested in Clara's palm, its paper envelope worn soft from handling and marked with careful notations in both English and Apache that recorded planting dates, growth patterns, and harvest yields from the garden that had become a symbol of hope for two communities, learning to grow together. 1 year had passed since her wedding to Apache Wind, and the small envelope contained seeds that had been collected from plants that thrived in both Apache and settler soil, creating literal bridges between worlds that had once seemed impossible to connect. Clara knelt beside the irrigation channel that Apache Wind had helped her father dig, using traditional Apache water management techniques combined with Thomas's engineering knowledge. The collaboration had produced a system more efficient than either culture could have developed alone, allowing the Whitman ranch to recover from the drought while demonstrating the practical benefits of cooperation between peoples who had previously viewed each other as enemies. "The corn is ready for the second planting," Apache Wind said in English, though they often spoke Apache at home as Clara continued to master the language that connected her to her husband's people. "The beans and squash should be planted together the way my grandmother taught me." Their garden reflected the cultural blending that had defined their first year of marriage, with traditional Apache crops growing alongside vegetables that Clara's mother had planted decades earlier. The three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, provided nutrients to the soil, while the European vegetables added variety to their diet and trade goods for the expanding commerce between their communities. The success of their agricultural experiments had attracted attention from other ranchers who were struggling with the same drought conditions that had nearly destroyed Thomas's livelihood. Apache water conservation methods, combined with settler farming techniques, had created a model for sustainable agriculture that was being studied and copied throughout the territory. Clara's pregnancy had been announced 3 months earlier, and her condition had been celebrated by both Apache and white communities as proof that love could indeed create new life that honored both heritages. Apache women had shared traditional remedies and birthing practices with Clara, while settler women had offered their own wisdom about pregnancy and child care. "Our daughter will know both worlds from birth," Clara said, her hand resting on the gentle curve of her belly as she planted seeds that their child would help harvest. "She'll speak both languages, understand both traditions, and maybe help others see that differences can make us stronger rather than weaker." Apache Wind smiled at his wife's certainty that they would have a daughter, though Apache tradition suggested that the first child would be a son who would carry forward the family name and responsibilities. Either way, their child would inherit a legacy of love that had overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. The trading post that Miguel had established had expanded into a genuine community center where Apache and settler families gathered for celebrations, business transactions, and the resolution of disputes that might have led to violence in earlier times. The success of the integrated community had attracted new settlers who were drawn by the opportunity to live peacefully with their Apache neighbors. Thomas had remarried 6 months earlier, wedding Mary Sullivan, the bookstore owner who had supported Clara's marriage from the beginning. Their quiet ceremony had been attended by both communities, demonstrating that the acceptance of cross-cultural relationships had created space for other forms of love that might have been discouraged in a more rigid society. "Your father seems happy," Apache Wind observed as they watched Thomas and Mary working together to repair a fence that separated their ranch from Apache grazing lands. "Marriage to a woman who shares his interests in books and learning has given him new purpose." Clara nodded, understanding that her father's contentment proved that love could bloom at any age for those brave enough to open their hearts to unexpected possibilities. Mary's influence had softened Thomas's remaining prejudices, while her practical knowledge of business had helped establish the ranch as a successful enterprise that no longer depended on desperate arrangements for survival. The school that had been established to serve children from both communities was housed in a new building that had been constructed through cooperative labor, with Apache and settler families working together to create an educational facility that honored both cultures. Clara had been asked to serve as a teacher, using her knowledge of both languages to help children navigate between the worlds they would inherit. The children learn so quickly when they don't have adults telling them that differences are something to fear, Clara observed, remembering her recent classroom experiences with mixed Apache and white students. They see Apache counting methods and settler arithmetic as equally useful tools rather than competing systems that require choosing sides. Apache Wind had been elected to serve on the territorial council that was developing policies for the integrated communities that were emerging throughout the Southwest. His position gave him influence over laws that would protect interracial marriages and ensure that mixed heritage children had full legal rights in American society. The peace treaty that had been signed at their wedding had been expanded and formalized through territorial legislation that used their community as a model for racial cooperation. Politicians from Washington had visited to study their success, and several other territories were implementing similar programs for integrating Native American and settler populations. Sheriff Morrison had been removed from office after it became clear that his racial prejudices made him unable to serve communities that included both Apache and white citizens. His replacement, Carlos Santos, brought a commitment to equal justice that had reduced tensions and created trust between law enforcement and all community members. Doc Hayes had indeed established the integrated medical practice he had proposed, with Apache healers and white doctors working together to provide health care that combined traditional remedies with modern medicine. The collaboration had produced breakthrough treatments for desert-related illnesses and had attracted medical students from Eastern universities who wanted to study innovative approaches to healthcare. The evening shadows grew longer as Clara and Apache Wind finished their planting, their shared labor creating neat rows of seeds that would mature into the food that would sustain their growing family through the coming year. Each plant represented hope for the future and proof that careful tending could make even the harshest soil productive. "Do you ever regret the choice we made?" Clara asked as they walked hand in hand toward the house they had built together, its architecture blending Apache and settler construction techniques to create a home that belonged fully to both traditions. "Never," Apache Wind replied without hesitation. "Every challenge we faced made us stronger. Every person who opposed us eventually came to understand that love is more powerful than hatred. Our marriage proved that bridges can be built between any peoples if they have the courage to meet each other halfway." The seed packet that had started their afternoon's work was carefully stored in the kitchen cabinet, where Clara kept her gardening supplies, filed alongside similar envelopes that contained the genetic heritage of plants that had traveled from many different cultures to find new life in the Southwest soil. Their home filled with the sounds of evening as Apache Wind practiced traditional songs that he would teach their daughter, while Clara prepared lessons for the mixed students who would arrive at school the next morning, ready to learn from a teacher who understood that education meant building bridges rather than walls between different ways of understanding the world. The first anniversary of their wedding had been celebrated by both communities with a festival that combined Apache and settler traditions in ways that created something entirely new while honoring everything that had come before. The celebration had attracted visitors from throughout the territory who wanted to see proof that racial cooperation was possible on the American frontier. As night fell over the ranch that had been saved by love rather than desperation, Clara and Apache Wind sat together on the porch they had built with wood from Apache forests and hardware from settler stores. Their child moved gently in Clara's womb, already responding to the voices of parents who had proven that some bridges are strong enough to span any distance if they are built with patience, courage, and the understanding that love recognizes no boundaries except those created by fear. The seed packet waited in darkness for the spring morning when new planting would begin, its contents carrying the promise of growth,
harvest, and the continuation of life that honors both the past and the future. Like the marriage it symbolized, the seeds would take root in soil that had been prepared by the careful work of two people who had chosen hope over fear, love over hatred, and the difficult courage of building something new over the easy comfort of accepting things as they had always been.